It is the 28th of December, 1879. A gale is coming off the North Sea at close to 80 miles an hour, and a train is crossing a bridge that nobody on board can properly see. 6 carriages, 75 souls, though nobody has ever agreed on the exact number. The Tay Bridge stretches nearly 2 miles across Blackwater, the longest bridge on Earth at the time, and Victorian Britain is very proud of it. The bridge had opened 18 months before. Queen Victoria herself had crossed it that summer and knighted the engineer, Thomas Bouch, on the spot. He was, by every account, a man who believed his own legend. What nobody in that royal carriage knew, what almost nobody knew, was that the high girders of the bridge had never been properly tested against wind load. Bouch had guessed at the numbers. He guessed wrong. On the night of the disaster, a signalman named Thomas Barclay watched the train's lights creep out onto the bridge from the North Shore. He watched them for less than a minute. Then, without warning, the lights simply stopped moving forward and dropped. There was no explosion, no scream carried across the water loud enough to be heard on land. Just a shower of sparks, visible for a heartbeat through horizontal rain, and then nothing but wind. The central navigation spans, 13 of them, had folded into the river like a hand closing, taking the train down with them into water that was, in places, over 100 feet deep. Recovery crews searched for weeks. The Firth of Tay is a tidal river, restless and cold, and it did not give its dead back easily. Some bodies were never found at all. They are, in a real sense, still down there. An inquiry followed, and it did what inquiries often do. It found a man to blame. Thomas Bouch, celebrated a year earlier, was ruined within months, his reputation dismantled almost as fast as his bridge had been. But blaming one man lets everyone else off far too easily. The truth is colder. An entire era had convinced itself that iron and confidence could outrun the weather, and the weather simply disagreed. The poet William McGonagall, no stranger to disaster himself as a writer, called it the saddest sight that he had ever seen. For once, the man history mocks for bad verse was not exaggerating. A second Tay Bridge was built a few years later, sturdier, wider, its stone piers still visible today, standing beside the new structure like a row of broken teeth. You can see them from a train window, even now. Every time a modern train crosses that river, it passes within feet of where the old bridge failed. Most passengers never look down. Most never know what is beneath them. This disaster is not where the railway story begins, but it is where I want to begin it because it tells you everything about what is coming. Speed, iron, ambition, and the bodies that get left behind when we build too fast and check too little. To understand how humanity got onto that doomed bridge, we have to go back roughly 200 years earlier into the dark and underground, where this entire story actually starts. Not with a locomotive, with a child, a candle, and a wooden wagon full of coal. The number of dead from that night was never settled with certainty, because the passenger list itself was incomplete, a detail that says a great deal about how casually the Victorian Railway still treated the people riding it, even as it bragged about the machines carrying them. Court of inquiry testimony later revealed that Bouch had cut corners on the wind bracing specifically to save money, choosing lighter cast iron columns over the sturdier design his own assistants had recommended, a decision made in an office far from any wind or water. Cast iron itself was part of the problem, a material strong under steady pressure but dangerously brittle under sudden shock, exactly the kind of shock a gale, slamming broadside into a 2-mile bridge would deliver again and again through that December night. Some of the salvaged wreckage was quietly melted down and repurposed, and a portion of the original ironwork, oddly enough, was reused decades later in other structures, meaning fragments of that doomed bridge are, in a strange and rarely mentioned way, still standing somewhere today. Contemporary illustrations of the disaster, printed within days in newspapers across Britain, tended to exaggerate the height of the waves and the violence of the storm, a kind of editorial embellishment that tells you something about how quickly tragedy becomes spectacle, even in an age without photographs to correct the record. Engineers studying the wreckage decades later, using methods unavailable to the original 1880 inquiry, concluded that the failure likely began not in the girders themselves, but in poorly cast lugs holding them together, a manufacturing flaw compounding a design flaw, compounding an act of nature, 3 failures stacking into one collapse. The families of the dead received almost nothing in the way of formal compensation, a detail modern readers often find shocking, but which was, for 1879, simply the accepted legal reality. Corporate liability for infrastructure failure was a concept still decades away from meaningful legal enforcement. There's a strange detail buried in the inquiry transcripts that rarely makes it into popular retellings. Several witnesses on shore that night reported seeing the train's lights flicker oddly moments before they vanished, a detail some engineers now interpret as the exact instant the girders began to give way beneath the moving carriages. The bridge's designer, stripped of his knighthood and all but named by public disgrace, spent his final months defending decisions he had made years earlier, a man watching his life's proudest achievement transform, in the span of a single winter night, into the thing he would be remembered for instead. Local fishermen on the Firth of Tay in the years after the disaster reported occasionally snagging fragments of twisted iron in their nets, small physical reminders surfacing at random, decades apart, from a collapse the river never fully released. It is worth noting, too, that Victorian Britain did not stop building ambitious bridges after Tay collapsed. If anything, the disaster hardened the profession, and the Firth of Forth Bridge, completed less than a decade later using a radically overbuilt cantilever design specifically intended to reassure a nervous public, still stands today, a direct engineering answer to the exact failure this chapter has just described. The signalman Thomas Barclay reportedly never fully recovered from what he witnessed that night, and later accounts describe him as a changed, withdrawn man for the rest of his working life. One more quiet casualty of a disaster that the official death toll never thought to count. Even now, engineers studying historic bridge failures use the Tay disaster as a foundational case study, taught in university courses specifically because it demonstrates so clearly how confidence, cost-cutting, and unchecked assumptions can combine into catastrophe even when every individual decision seemed, at the time, entirely reasonable to the people making it. Picture a tunnel 3 feet high. No lamps, but a single candle stuck to a cap with clay. A child of 9 or 10, on hands and knees, hauling a wooden wagon loaded with coal along 2 parallel rails set into the mud. This is roughly 1720, somewhere in the coal fields of Northumberland or Durham, and this child has likely never seen a locomotive, because locomotives do not exist yet. What exists is wood. Wooden rails, wooden wheels, wooden wagons. The idea was simple and brutal in its efficiency. Wheels roll easier on a smooth track than on rutted mud, so lay down rails, even crude wooden ones, and a single horse or a single child can move far more coal than either could on open ground. These wagonways predate the steam locomotive by more than a century. Some historians trace crude rail systems back to German mining regions in the 1500s, tracks scratched into the historical record almost as an afterthought. By the early 1600s, wagonways were common enough across northern England that they had a name, the Newcastle Road, though there was nothing resembling a modern road about them at all, just timber and mud and men. Underground, conditions were something closer to what we would now call torture. Low roofs, standing water, foul air that could kill without warning, a silent gas that miners called choke damp for reasons that require no explanation. Women worked down there too, for far less pay than the men, dragging tubs of coal on chains harnessed around their waists, crawling on all fours through passages barely tall enough to kneel in. This was not rare. This was Tuesday. Children as young as 5 were employed as trappers, sitting alone in absolute darkness for 12 hours at a stretch, opening and closing ventilation doors each time a wagon needed to pass. Alone, in the dark, all day. It would take until 1842 and a horrifying government report full of testimony from the children themselves before Britain passed a law banning women and children under 10 from working underground at all. Read that again. 1842. Above ground, the wagonways kept spreading. Following the coal seems like roots following water. Iron began replacing wood on the rails themselves by the late 1700s because iron lasted longer and carried heavier loads without splintering. By 1767, a Shropshire ironmaster named Richard Reynolds was casting iron rails at his works in Coalbrookdale, in the valley now considered by many historians the literal birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. Coalbrookdale is worth sitting with for a moment. This is a narrow, wooded valley in Shropshire that quietly, almost accidentally, changed the shape of the modern world, simply because a man named Abraham Darby figured out how to smelt iron with coke instead of charcoal. Coke smelting meant iron could be produced faster, cheaper, and in far greater volume than ever before. And more iron meant more rails, more wagons, more wheels, more of everything this story is about to become. None of this looked like a railway yet, not in the way we picture one. No locomotives, no timetables, no stations. Just horses straining against wooden and then iron rails, and beneath the ground, human beings straining against something far heavier than coal. But the essential idea, the one that changes everything, was already in place by the late 1700s. Guide the wheel, reduce the friction, move more, with less effort for less cost. It is a simple idea. It would prove almost impossible to stop once it started moving. Somewhere in a Cornish workshop, a restless, difficult, brilliant engineer was already staring at a stationary steam engine and wondering something nobody had seriously wondered before. What if the engine itself could move? Ventilation in these early mines was so poor that miners sometimes kept caged birds, canaries most famously, though that particular practice became standard slightly later, as an early warning system against gases that had no smell and gave no other sign before they killed a man mid-breath. Wagonway routes were often laid out with almost obsessive attention to gradient, because a horse could pull a far heavier load on a gentle, carefully engineered slope than on rough natural ground, and that same obsession with gradient would carry directly forward into every railway built afterward. Some of the earliest recorded wagonway disputes were not about safety at all, but about right-of-way. Mine owners suing each other over which company's wagons had priority on a shared stretch of track, a very early and very mundane preview of the traffic conflicts that would plague railways for the next 2 centuries. By the 1770s, a small number of these lines had grown long enough and busy enough that observers began describing them using language that sounds startlingly modern: timetables of a rough sort, scheduled runs, even primitive versions of what we would now recognize as freight priority. It is worth remembering before the steam engine ever enters this story that the essential grammar of the railway, 2 parallel rails, a fixed gauge, wheels flange to stay on track, was already fully formed underground, built by anonymous engineers whose names did not survive, solving problems for horses and children that would later be solved with far more fanfare for locomotives. Parliamentary reformers who pushed through the 1842 Mines Act, most notably Lord Ashley, later the Earl of Shaftesbury, relied heavily on the shocking illustrated testimony of the children themselves, drawings and descriptions so visceral that even a parliament generally reluctant to regulate industry felt compelled to act. The transition from wood to iron rail was not instantaneous or universal, and some smaller colliery lines continued using wooden rails, sometimes capped with a thin strip of iron for durability. Well into the 19th century, long after the major railways had moved entirely to solid iron and eventually steel. Horses used on the wagonways were themselves subject to genuinely brutal working conditions, often kept underground for extended periods in stables cut into the rock, rarely seeing daylight, an animal welfare horror that existed alongside and was largely overshadowed by the human suffering of the same mines. Archaeologists excavating former colliery sites in recent decades have recovered wooden rail fragments still bearing the wear patterns of individual wagon wheels, physical evidence of routes and journeys that no written record ever thought worth preserving, small mundane details rescued from the ground itself. The transition from horsepower to steam power on these early industrial lines did not happen all at once. And for a surprisingly long stretch of the early 19th century, horses and locomotives worked the same route side by side, an uneasy, overlapping handover between two very different eras of labor. The transition of these wagonways into what we would now recognize as public railways happened gradually enough that no single date can honestly claim to mark the moment mining infrastructure became genuine public transport, a slow blur rather than a clean historical line. Parliamentary Select Committee record from the 1830s and 1840s, when read closely, reveal mine owners repeatedly arguing that regulation of child labor would render British coal uncompetitive against foreign production, an economic argument that appears in nearly identical form throughout the history of nearly every labor reform this documentary touches, right up through the 20th century and beyond. It is worth remembering that the coal these children hauled fueled not just the railways eventually built above them, but also the iron foundries, the textile mills, and nearly every other engine of the Industrial Revolution, meaning their labor sits, largely uncredited, beneath almost every chapter still to come in this documentary. The mines that spawned these first wagonways were themselves already centuries old by the time steam power arrived, meaning the underground railway tradition this chapter traces was already a mature, well-established practice long before it ever earned a single line in a general history book. Cornwall, February 1804. A crowd gathers at the Penydarren Iron Works in South Wales to watch something no human being has ever seen before, an engine that pulls itself and 10 tons of iron and 70 men along 9 miles of track. The man behind it, Richard Trevithick, was a Cornish engineer built like the mine wrestlers he grew up around, 6'2", famously strong, famously stubborn, and famously bad with money for his entire life. Trevithick's genius was pressure, where James Watt, the reigning god of steam power, insisted on low-pressure engines for safety. Trevithick built high-pressure engines that were smaller, lighter, and violently more powerful, what reportedly considered him reckless. The Penydarren locomotive worked. It hauled its load the full 9 miles at roughly 5 miles an hour, a speed that sounds absurd today and felt, to the people watching in 1804, like witnessing something closer to sorcery than engineering. But it also cracked the cast iron rails beneath it again and again, because the rails built for horses were never designed to carry an engine's weight. The very ground beneath the future kept breaking under its own promise. Trevithick built more locomotives after that. In 1808, in a fenced enclosure near London, he called, with a showman's flourish, "Catch me who can," he charged curious Londoners a shilling to ride a steam engine in a circle. It was part invention, part carnival act. Some of those Londoners loved it. Others were unnerved in a way that is hard to overstate. Here was a machine that moved with no animal pulling it, that hissed and clanked and belched smoke that seemed, in the candlelit imagination of the age, almost alive. There's a reason writers of the period reached for dragon imagery, for words like monster and beast, when they tried to describe these machines. It was not just poetry. It was the honest, uneasy language of people watching fire and iron move under its own will for the first time. Trevithick, for all his brilliance, never turned any of it into lasting wealth. His attention scattered across a dozen ventures, several of them in South America, and he came home from Peru in 1827 broke, ill, and largely forgotten by the industry he had ignited. He died in 1833 in Kent, so poor that his fellow engineers had to pay for his funeral out of their own pockets. The man who first proved a locomotive could work was buried in an unmarked grave. It is a genuinely bitter irony, and I think it deserves to be said plainly. The dragon he woke would go on to reshape continents, and the man who woke it could not afford his own coffin. Other engineers picked up where he left off. William Hedley built Puffing Billy in 1813, still remarkably the oldest surviving steam locomotive in the world, now resting quietly behind glass in London instead of hauling coal in Northumberland. And in a colliery not far from where that child once crawled through the dark with his wagon, a self-taught engineer named George Stephenson was watching all of this very, very closely and doing his own quiet calculations. Stephenson had grown up illiterate, taught himself to read at 18 using a night school built for working men, and had an instinct for machinery that bordered on the uncanny. He did not invent the locomotive. He was about to make it undeniable. By 1829, the question was no longer whether a steam locomotive could pull a load along iron rails. Trevithick and Hedley had already answered that. The question now was whether it could go fast enough and reliably enough to replace the horse entirely on a public stage in front of judges who wanted proof. That contest had a name, a place, and a date already fixed on a calendar. Rainhill, Lancashire, October 1829. Tens of thousands of people were about to gather to watch iron beasts race each other, and not everyone in that crowd was cheering. James Watt's patents on low-pressure steam technology, still in force during Trevithick's early experiments, created a genuine legal obstacle, and Trevithick's decision to pursue high-pressure steam was partly a deliberate engineering workaround of Watt's intellectual property, as much a legal strategy as a scientific one. The boilers of this era were genuinely dangerous, built without any standardized safety valve testing, and boiler explosions killed and maimed workers and bystanders with a regularity that would be utterly unacceptable by any modern industrial safety standard, a fact the era largely accepted as simply the cost of progress. Trevithick's road locomotive, an earlier experiment before his railway engines, actually predates the Penydarren run by several years. A steam carriage he drove through the streets of Camborne in Cornwall on Christmas Eve of 1801, terrifying and delighting onlookers roughly equally, according to the letters that survive. William Hedley's Puffing Billy, built to solve a very practical wartime fuel shortage problem when horse feed prices spiked during the Napoleonic Wars, proved that a smooth iron wheel on a smooth iron rail could grip and pull without slipping, settling an engineering debate that had genuinely divided experts of the era. George Stephenson's early career included building and maintaining stationary engines at Killingworth Colliery, work that taught him the mechanical patience and hands-on troubleshooting instinct that would later separate him from more theoretically trained engineers who understood equations better than they understood grease and iron. Trevithick's rivalry with the established steam engineering establishment of his day extended well beyond James Watt, and he spent much of his career fighting for recognition and funding against a technical community that often dismissed high-pressure steam as reckless showmanship rather than legitimate engineering. A monument to Trevithick was eventually erected in Camborne, Cornwall, in the 20th century, a belated civic recognition of a man whose own contemporaries largely let him die in obscurity, the kind of posthumous honor that historians of industry have noted arrives with grim regularity, only once it can no longer help the person being honored. George Stephenson's insistence on a standard track gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches, adapted directly from the wagonway gauges he grew up around in the coal fields, would eventually become the dominant gauge for roughly 60% of the world's railways, an almost accidental inheritance from centuries of mining tradition. Trevithick's Cornish contemporaries remembered him as a man who could outlift, outdrink, and outwork almost anyone in the mining districts, a physical folk hero whose engineering brilliance was, in local memory, almost inseparable from sheer bodily strength and stubborn Cornish pride. The Catch Me Who Can enclosure in London, though a commercial failure that closed within weeks after the track cracked under repeated use, is now recognized by historians as arguably the world's very first purpose-built railway amusement attraction, a genuinely odd footnote in the birth of an industry that would go on to reshape continents. Even Trevithick's failures taught the industry something. The cracked rails at Penydarren directly informed later decisions to build heavier, better-supported tracks specifically engineered for locomotive weight rather than horse-drawn wagons, an expensive lesson paid for in broken iron rather than broken bodies, for once. It is genuinely striking, looking back, how quickly public sentiment about the steam locomotive shifted from cautious dread in 1804 to enthusiastic civic pride by the 1830s, a transformation that happened within a single working lifetime and offers a useful reminder that societies can, and often do, learn to love the very machines that once frightened them most. The gap between Trevithick's first working locomotive in 1804 and Stephenson's triumphant rocket in 1829 spans just 25 years, a genuinely short window for an entirely new category of machine to go from terrifying novelty to the settled, undisputed future of land transport. There is a particular kind of poetic justice, or perhaps just irony, in the fact that Trevithick's high-pressure steam principle, dismissed as reckless by the era's most celebrated engineer, went on to become the industry standard for well over a century, while Watt's cautious low-pressure approach was quietly abandoned by nearly everyone who actually wanted a locomotive that could move. It says something about how quickly this technology matured that within a single generation, the same basic locomotive principle Trevithick first proved on 9 miles of Welsh tram road was already being scaled up to haul passengers across entire nations, a pace of technological maturation that had genuinely few precedents in prior human history. October 1829, a flat stretch of track outside the Lancashire village of Rainhill. Grandstands packed with spectators. 10,000 people on the first day alone. Some estimates say closer to 15,000 across the trials. All come to watch machines race for a prize of £500. The organizers, directors of the new Liverpool and Manchester Railway, needed to decide once and for all whether steam locomotives or fixed cable engines should power their line. They set a series of brutal tests: speed, reliability, weight, fuel efficiency. 5 engines entered. Most would not finish. Novelty broke down. Sans Perel cracked a cylinder and burned through coke at a punishing rate. Cyclope, powered by an actual horse walking on a treadmill built into the machine itself, was disqualified almost immediately and honestly deservedly mocked for it. Then came Rocket, built by George Stephenson with his son Robert, painted a bright, almost defiant yellow, and fitted with an innovation that changed everything quietly happening inside its boiler. Dozens of narrow copper tubes instead of one wide flue, multiplying the heating surface many times over. Rocket averaged close to 13 miles an hour hauling its load, and on a lighter test run touched genuinely startling 29 miles an hour. To a public who had never traveled faster than a galloping horse, that number sounded less like engineering and more like a threat. Rocket won decisively, and the Liverpool and Manchester Railway committed fully to steam traction. The date is worth remembering. This is the moment the steam railway stops being a curiosity for coal fields and becomes, unmistakably, the future. The Liverpool and Manchester line opened less than a year later, on the 15th of September, 1830, with the Duke of Wellington himself among the dignitaries riding in the opening procession. It was meant to be a triumphant day. It became something else entirely by the afternoon. A member of Parliament named William Huskisson stepped down from his carriage during a stop to greet the Duke. He misjudged the moment, wandered onto the adjacent track, and Stephenson's own rocket, approaching on that line, could not stop in time. Huskisson's leg was crushed. He died that same evening from his injuries, becoming almost certainly the first widely reported railway fatality of the passenger age, on the very day that age officially began. The symbolism did not need any embellishment. It wrote itself. Newspapers covered the opening day, triumph, and Huskisson's death in the same columns, sometimes the same paragraph, and readers absorbed both facts at once. Here was a machine that could connect cities in hours instead of days. And here was a man already dead beneath its wheels. This pairing, wonder and horror arriving together, is not a coincidence of one bad afternoon. It becomes the emotional pattern of the entire railway century. Every leap in speed buys a corresponding leap in what happens when something goes wrong. Physicians of the era genuinely debated whether the human body could survive sustained speeds above 30 miles an hour, worrying that organs might be shaken loose, or that the brain itself could not process a landscape blurring past that fast. It sounds absurd now. It was earnest medical opinion then. Clergymen preached against the railway from pulpits, warning that God had never intended man to travel faster than a horse, and that some unnamed judgment would surely follow this arrogance. Some of that fear was superstition. Some of it, frankly, turned out to be a fairly reasonable prediction. Because the derailments came quickly, rails that buckled in summer heat, boilers that exploded without warning, scattering scalding metal and steam across platforms crowded with people who had no idea such a thing was even possible. The learning curve of the railway age was written in bodies. And yet none of it slowed anything down. If anything, the danger became part of the appeal. A dark thrill folded into the romance of speed itself. Within a decade, railway mileage in Britain would multiply many times over, funded by an investing public who had, it seemed, decided the risk was worth it. That decision, to throw money at railways faster than anyone could sensibly manage, was about to produce one of the strangest financial madnesses in British history. Fortunes built on nothing but paper and hope. And like most fortunes built on nothing, they were about to come due. The £500 prize at Rainhill, worth a genuinely substantial sum in 1829, was less important to Stephenson than the resulting contract to supply locomotives for the entire Liverpool and Manchester line, a commercial stake that turned the trials into as much a business negotiation as a sporting spectacle. Judges at Rainhill included engineers who had genuine doubts that any locomotive could reliably outperform a fixed cable haulage system, and several respected voices in the industry publicly predicted, right up until the trials themselves, that steam traction would prove too unreliable for a major commercial line. Crowds at the trials were reportedly rowdy enough that organizers had to rope off sections of track, and at least one contemporary account described spectators placing informal bets on which engine would fail first, treating the entire event with the same energy as a horse race rather than an engineering demonstration. The rocket's copper fire tube boiler design, developed with input from Stephenson's business partner Henry Booth, was the single innovation that separated it most clearly from its competitors, and variations on that same multi-tube boiler principle remained standard in steam locomotive design for well over a century afterward. William Huskisson, ironically, had been one of the railway's most prominent political supporters in Parliament, a man who understood better than most of his colleagues just how much the new technology could transform British trade, killed by the very invention he had worked hardest to champion. The Duke of Wellington, present for Huskisson's death, was reportedly deeply shaken by the incident and initially wanted the opening day celebrations canceled entirely, before being persuaded that the train should continue on to Manchester as planned, a decision that drew sharp public criticism at the time. Newspapers covering the Rainhill trials sent correspondents specifically to report on the spectacle for a national audience hungry for news of the new technology, arguably one of the earliest examples of dedicated technology journalism in British publishing history, decades before the term itself would have made any sense to anyone. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway's early timetable, astonishingly precise for its era, listed departures to the minute, a level of scheduling discipline that startled contemporaries accustomed to the far looser rhythms of coach and canal travel, and effectively introduced the modern concept of standardized time to ordinary daily life. Within a decade of opening, railway companies across Britain found themselves forced to coordinate local time across different towns, a practical scheduling problem that led directly to the eventual adoption of standardized railway time, later formalized as Greenwich Mean Time, one of the railway's quietest but most far-reaching legacies. Contemporary medical journals in the years immediately following Rainhill actually published serious studies attempting to measure physiological effects of high-speed rail travel on volunteer passengers, research that today reads as almost comic in its earnestness, but which reflected a genuine and widespread scientific uncertainty about what this new experience might do to the human body. Robert Stephenson, George's son and full engineering partner, went on to design some of the era's most ambitious bridges and viaducts, carrying his father's practical, hands-on engineering instincts into an entirely new generation of infrastructure that would define the Victorian landscape for decades to come. The 5 engines entered at Rainhill each represented a genuinely different philosophy of locomotive design, and engineering historians still study the trials specifically because they capture, in a single compressed week, an entire industry's worth of competing technical approaches being tested head-to-head under real public pressure. Stephenson's rocket itself survives today, preserved and displayed at the Science Museum in London, its yellow paint long faded, its boiler cold, but still recognizably the same machine that startled and thrilled a Lancashire crowd nearly 2 centuries ago, a rare direct physical link between the modern viewer and this documentary's earliest chapters. Within 5 years of the Rainhill trials, railway construction had spread well beyond Britain, with early lines opening in the United States, France, and Germany, each nation adapting the basic Stephenson template to its own terrain, politics, and industrial priorities. Newspaper editorials in the weeks after Rainhill debated fiercely whether steam power represented genuine progress or a dangerous, unnatural overreach, a debate that, in its basic shape, would repeat itself almost identically around every subsequent leap in transportation technology for the next 2 centuries. By the 1840s, Britain had caught a fever, and its symptoms were spreadsheets. Investors of every class, dukes and clerks and widows living on modest annuities, were pouring their savings into railway company shares, often for lines that existed only as lines drawn on a prospectus. At the fever's peak in 1845 and 1846, Parliament authorized construction of over 8,000 miles of new railway, roughly triple the mileage already built in the previous 2 decades combined. Nobody stopped to ask if Britain actually needed that much railway. The question that mattered was whether the shares would rise. A single share, purchased for a small deposit, could double or triple in value within weeks, simply on the promise of a railway that had not laid 1 inch of track. People were not investing in transportation. They were gambling on paper, and the paper, for a while, kept climbing. The newspapers of the day were saturated with advertisements for new companies, some entirely fraudulent, promoting routes that made no engineering sense, through terrain nobody had properly surveyed, backed by directors who in some cases did not exist under the names given. Even Charles Darwin, cautious and methodical in every other part of his life, admitted to buying railway shares during the Mania. If a man that careful could get swept up in it, you begin to understand just how total the madness had become. The Mania could not last, and everyone sensible knew it could not last, which somehow did not stop anyone from participating anyway. That particular blindness, watching a bubble form and joining it regardless, is not unique to the 1840s. It is depressingly familiar in every century since. The collapse began in late 1845 and deepened through 1847 as the Bank of England raised interest rates and investors, suddenly needing cash to cover deposits on shares they had never actually paid for in full, started selling everything at once. Share prices that had tripled came crashing back to a fraction of their peak within months. Families who had mortgaged their futures on paper railway fortunes found themselves holding certificates worth almost nothing for companies that in many cases would never lay a single rail. Estimates of the total capital loss during the railway mania run into the hundreds of millions of pounds in the currency of the day, an almost unthinkable sum, wiped out in a financial event that barely gets mentioned in most general histories of Britain. And the countryside itself carries physical scars from the mania that are still visible today, if you know where to look. Half-dug cuttings that stop abruptly in a field, embankments raised and then simply abandoned, grown over now with a century and a half of grass and hawthorn. Some of these ghost routes were surveyed with genuine engineering skill, real bridges partly built, real tunnels partly bored, before the money simply vanished and the navvies were sent home unpaid, or paid in scrip from companies that folded within the year. It is a strange thing to stand in a quiet English field and realize you are standing on the skeleton of somebody's ruined life, a line that was supposed to carry coal or passengers or profit, and instead carries nothing at all except weeds and the occasional dog walker. The railways that did survive the crash, the ones with real engineering behind them and real demand along their routes, consolidated into the great companies that would define British rail travel for the next century. The Great Western, the London and Northwestern, names that still echo in station architecture today. But the human cost of the mania is easy to lose in that consolidation story. Real families lost real homes. There were documented cases of suicide directly tied to railway share losses, quiet tragedies buried in the small print of newspapers otherwise celebrating the age of progress. Britain licked its wounds, tightened its regulations, and kept building anyway, because by the 1850s the railway had already become too useful, too woven into commerce and daily life, to abandon over one bad decade of speculation. But none of that construction, not 1 mile of it, happened without labor. And the men who actually dug the cuttings and blasted the tunnels and laid the sleepers were not the investors reading share prices in London drawing rooms. They were the navvies, and their story is written in blood, not paper. Parliamentary committees reviewing new railway bills during the mania were badly overwhelmed, in some sessions approving dozens of competing schemes for the same stretch of countryside without adequate scrutiny of the engineering plans or the financial backing behind them, a regulatory failure baked directly into the crash that followed. George Hudson, nicknamed the Railway King by the press at the height of his influence, controlled a genuinely enormous portion of Britain's rail network through aggressive acquisition and, as later investigations revealed, outright accounting fraud, before his empire collapsed spectacularly alongside the wider mania. Hudson's fall from grace was total. Once cheered in the streets and courted by the aristocracy, he died decades later in genuinely reduced circumstances, a cautionary tale that Victorian moralists loved to retell precisely because it fit their preferred narrative about the wages of financial excess. Small investors were disproportionately hurt by the crash because railway shares have been marketed directly to the growing middle class as a safe, respectable investment, quite unlike the riskier colonial ventures of earlier decades, a betrayal of that promised safety that stung particularly hard. Engineers of genuine talent, including Isambard Kingdom Brunel, continued working through the crash and its aftermath, and it is worth remembering that some of the era's most enduring engineering achievements, the Great Western Main Line among them, were built on financing that survived the mania specifically because the underlying business case was sound. The satirical press of the 1840s had a field day with the railway mania, publishing cartoons depicting investors as sleepwalkers marching cheerfully toward cliffs, a visual metaphor that proved, in hindsight, considerably more accurate than most of the era's earnest financial journalism. Some of the mania-era companies that failed had genuinely absurd proposed routes, including lines that would have required tunneling through geologically unstable ground purely to shave a few miles off a journey. Engineering ambition entirely divorced from engineering sense, chasing investor excitement rather than any real transportation need. The Economist magazine, founded in 1843 partly in response to the debates swirling around railway investment and free trade, became one of the era's most consistent voices warning about the unsustainable pace of railway speculation, warnings that were, for several crucial years, almost entirely ignored. Railway share certificates from the Mania era have become, in a strange twist of history, minor collector's items today, ornate engraved documents originally meant to represent genuine wealth, now valued mainly as curious relics of one of the most spectacular financial delusions of the entire 19th century. The lessons of the railway mania were, somewhat predictably, only partially absorbed by subsequent generations of investors, and financial historians have drawn direct, explicit comparisons between the 1840s railway bubble and speculative technology bubbles of the 20th and 21st centuries, the specific technology changing while the underlying human psychology stays remarkably consistent. Railway mania pamphlets promising guaranteed returns used language and promotional techniques that modern financial regulators would immediately recognize as textbook warning signs, a reminder that the specific vocabulary of financial persuasion has changed remarkably little across nearly 2 centuries. The half-built embankments and abandoned cuttings left behind by the mania were, in a handful of documented cases, later revived decades afterward by entirely different companies pursuing entirely different routes, meaning some genuine Victorian-era railway lines were quietly built atop the bones of speculative failures their original navvies never lived to see completed. Historians estimate that at the very peak of the mania in 1846, railway-related spending accounted for a genuinely staggering proportion of total British capital investment, a concentration of national financial energy into a single speculative sector that would not be matched again until the technology bubbles of more recent decades. It took the better part of a decade for public trust in railway investment to fully recover after the mania's collapse, a slow rebuilding of confidence achieved largely through the demonstrated, unglamorous reliability of the surviving major companies rather than through any single dramatic gesture or government intervention. A cutting collapses without warning near Woodhead in the Pennines sometime in the 1840s. A wall of wet clay and shale comes down in seconds, and a man is buried to his chest before his mates can even shout his name. They dig with their hands because there is no time to find proper tools, and by the time they reach him, it no longer matters. This was not an unusual Tuesday on a Victorian railway cutting. It was closer to routine. The word navvy comes from navigator, originally used for the men who dug Britain's canals in the previous century, and it simply migrated to the railway builders who followed the same brutal trade with a new kind of ditch. By the 1840s, an estimated 250,000 men were employed as navvies across Britain at the height of construction, a mobile army of labor that followed the railway lines the way camp followers once trailed behind soldiers. Many were Irish, driven across the water by poverty, and from 1845 onward, by the horror of the Great Famine unfolding at home. Many others were Scottish Highlanders and English farm laborers displaced by enclosure and agricultural change. All of them shared one thing: nobody had much use for their lives beyond their labor. The work itself was almost entirely manual. Pick, shovel, wheelbarrow, and black powder for blasting, later replaced by the far more volatile and far deadlier dynamite once it became widely available in the 1870s. A single navvy might move 20 tons of earth in a single day with a shovel and a barrow run up a wooden plank, a physical output that modern labor historians still find difficult to fully credit, until you remember the alternative to working that hard was simply not eating. Death came in every conceivable form. Tunnel collapses, premature detonations, when a fuse burned faster than a man could scramble clear, falls from scaffolding on viaducts hundreds of feet above a valley floor, with no harness, no net, nothing but the wind to catch you. The construction of the Woodhead Tunnel through the Pennines, completed in 1845, killed an estimated 32 men during its building, a toll roughly comparable, by some grim contemporary comparisons to the casualty rate of certain military campaigns of the era. This was a tunnel, not a battlefield. The comparison still holds. Disease moved through the shanty camps that sprang up around every major construction site with terrifying speed. Cholera, typhus, and simple malnutrition killed as efficiently as any tunnel collapse in camps with no sanitation, no clean water, and no medical care beyond whatever the navvies could provide for each other. There was no compensation system worth the name. If a man died, his family, if he had one nearby, received nothing beyond whatever sympathy his mates could scrape together in a collection passed around the camp. Companies simply hired another man from the endless supply arriving on the next boat or the next road. Contemporary estimates, imprecise because nobody kept careful records of navvy deaths, suggest that thousands died during the core decades of British railway construction between the 1830s and 1870s. Some historians place the true figure considerably higher, since so many deaths in remote camps were never formally recorded at all. There's something quietly damning in that gap in the record. The railway itself was documented with obsessive precision, every gradient measured, every girder cataloged. The men who built it were, in the paperwork of the age, almost an afterthought. A handful of navvy missions and chaplains, most notably the work of Elizabeth Garnett in the later Victorian period, try to bring some measure of welfare and dignity to the camps, schools for the children who lived alongside their fathers, basic medical care, a chapel tent on Sundays. It was not nearly enough, but it was more than the companies offered. Walk certain stretches of the British countryside today, particularly near old tunnel mouths in the Pennines or the Scottish borders, and you can still find small, unmarked mounds that local historians believe are navvy graves, men buried close to where they fell, with no stone and no name. That same brutal arithmetic, that a laborer's life was worth less than the schedule he was slowing down, was about to travel far beyond Britain's coastline. It was about to be applied, with even less restraint, to an empire an ocean away, where the railway would carry not just cargo, but control itself. Navvy gangs developed their own internal culture almost entirely separate from settled society, a rough code of loyalty, heavy drinking on Saturday nights, and a fierce, almost tribal pride in the physical difficulty of the work, all of it a coping mechanism for men who genuinely never knew if they would survive the following week. Contractors were paid by the engineering company per completed mile of track, which created a direct financial incentive to push laborers harder and faster, and to skimp on safety measures like proper timber shoring in tunnels and cuttings, a business structure that all but guaranteed unnecessary deaths. Women in the navvy camps, often wives or partners of the laborers, took on enormous informal responsibility for basic camp welfare, cooking, laundry, and rudimentary nursing, work that was entirely unpaid and almost entirely unacknowledged in any official record of how these railways actually got built. The Kilsby Tunnel on the London and Birmingham line struck an underground quicksand during construction in the 1830s, flooding the workings and requiring pumps to run continuously for 8 months just to keep the tunnel dry enough to keep digging, at a cost in both money and lives that nearly bankrupted the contractor. By the later Victorian period, some improvement did arrive, driven partly by public pressure and partly by simple labor shortages that forced contractors to treat their workforce with slightly more care, though the fundamental power imbalance between navvy and company never meaningfully shifted before the era of mass railway construction wound down. Navvy wages, while brutal in terms of physical demand, were actually relatively high compared to agricultural labor of the same period, which explains why so many men, fully aware of the danger, still chose this work over the alternative of near-starvation wages on a farm. Some navvy camps developed informal mutual aid societies, early forms of workplace insurance where men would pool a small portion of their wages to support the family of anyone killed or seriously injured on the job, a rough, self-organized safety net built entirely from below because none existed from above. The Settle to Carlisle line, built through the Yorkshire Dales in the 1870s, remains one of the most physically demanding railway construction projects ever undertaken in Britain. Its navvy death toll, concentrated particularly around the construction of Ribble Head Viaduct, still commemorated by a small memorial near the site today. Some navvy communities developed a distinct dialect and slang, blending Irish, Scottish, and regional English influences into a working vocabulary specific to the construction camps, most of which has, like the men who spoke it, simply vanished from the historical record without any formal documentation ever attempted. Photographs of navvy gangs, where they survive at all, tend to show men posed stiffly for the camera in their best clothes rather than captured mid-labor, meaning the visual record of what this work actually looked like in practice is considerably thinner than the written accounts that survive alongside it. The physical scale of what navvies actually moved becomes almost abstract in the numbers, but consider a single major cutting, sometimes representing more earth moved by hand that had been shifted for entire medieval cathedrals, achieved not over centuries, but within a handful of exhausting years. A small number of navvy graves have, in recent years, been formally identified and marked through the combined efforts of local historians, church records, and ground-penetrating survey technology, a slow, deliberate act of restoring names to men who spent nearly 2 centuries as anonymous mounds in quiet corners of the British countryside. Contractors occasionally imported labor from further afield when local supply ran short, and there are documented instances of navvy gangs, including men who had traveled from continental Europe specifically for railway construction work, an early, largely forgotten thread of the same international labor migration story that runs throughout this entire series. The physical toll of navvy work left visible marks on survivors well into old age, and pension record from later charitable societies occasionally describe men in their 60s still carrying injuries, curved spines, and missing fingers, directly traceable to specific documented construction accidents decades earlier. Madras Presidency, 1876. A grain train rolls south toward the coast, its wagons stacked high, moving through a district where the fields on either side of the track have gone the color of old bone, and the people watching it pass are dying of hunger within sight of the food. This is not a coincidence, and it was not a secret at the time either. Grain was being moved by rail to ports for export, sold at prices that famine-stricken villagers could not possibly afford, while colonial administrators debated policy in comfortable offices in Calcutta and London. The Great Indian Peninsula Railway had begun construction in the early 1850s, championed by figures like Lord Dalhousie, who spoke of railways bringing prosperity and unity to the subcontinent. Some of that language was sincere. All of it conveniently served a second, quieter purpose. That second purpose was control. Troops could be moved across vast distances in days instead of weeks, decisively useful after the rebellion of 1857, when colonial authorities realized just how dangerous a slow response could be to their hold on the subcontinent. Raw cotton, tea, and grain could be pulled from the interior toward coastal ports built for export to British mills and British markets, at freight rates structured to favor that exact flow, inland to coast, rather than any route that might have served local trade between Indian regions. By the time of the Madras famine of 1876 to 1878, India had a genuinely extensive rail network, and that network became, in the documented analysis of numerous historians since, a mechanism that could move food toward profitable export markets, even while local populations started a short train ride away. Estimates of the death toll during that single famine period range from 5 to 10 million people, figures so large they become difficult to hold in the mind as anything other than a statistic, though every one of those numbers was of course an individual person with a name nobody outside their village remembers. British colonial officials at the time largely subscribed to a rigid economic doctrine that discouraged direct famine relief, on the theory that intervention would distort market prices and encourage what they termed dependency. Grain kept moving to port under armed guard, past villages where people were dying in the streets. The railway, in this specific and well-documented context, did the opposite of what its boosters promised. It did not connect India's food surplus to India's hunger. It connected India's food surplus to Liverpool and London, while leaving the hunger exactly where it found it. This is not a fringe interpretation. Economic historians, including scholars working from British colonial records themselves, have documented in detail how rail infrastructure, built with genuine engineering skill and enormous capital investment, was simultaneously weaponized as a tool of extraction that worsened the very famines it is often credited with alleviating. It would be simple and wrong to say the railway caused the famine. Drought caused the famine, but the railway determined, with brutal efficiency, who the famine's grain would ultimately feed, and it was very rarely the people standing closest to the empty fields. There is a particular kind of horror in infrastructure this well-engineered being turned to purposes this cruel. The same precision that laid a perfectly graded rail bed through difficult terrain also calculated, with equal precision, the most profitable route for grain leaving a starving district. India's railway network by the early 20th century had grown into one of the largest in the world, a genuine engineering achievement built substantially by Indian labor under British direction, on terms that overwhelmingly benefited British capital and British administrative control. After independence in 1947, that same network became the literal backbone of a newly sovereign nation's economy, repurposed by Indian engineers and administrators into something closer to what its original promotional language had claimed it would be all along. History does occasionally allow for a kind of correction. But the famine years remain a permanent stain on the story, a reminder that the same rails, the same locomotives, the same disciplined timetables that Victorian engineers were so proud it could just as easily starve a population as feed one, depending entirely on whose hand was on the throttle. Halfway across the world, on a continent Europeans had only recently begun calling their own to settle, an almost identical machine was about to be deployed against an almost identical target, a land, its resources, and the people who already live there. The railway rate structures set by British colonial authorities in India were deliberately calibrated to move raw materials toward ports and finished British goods back into the interior, a pattern economic historians have described as textbook colonial extraction, engineered directly into freight pricing rather than left to chance. Indian capital financed a substantial share of this railway construction through a guaranteed return system that obligated the Indian treasury, funded by Indian taxpayers, to cover returns to largely British shareholders regardless of whether individual lines actually turn a profit, a financial arrangement that transferred risk downward and profit upward with striking efficiency. Famine commissions convened by the British government after the worst famines did occasionally recommend changes to relief policy, though implementation was slow and inconsistent, and subsequent famines in the following decades revealed how little had genuinely changed in the underlying priorities governing food distribution. Indian engineers and workers who built this network developed genuine technical expertise across these decades, expertise that colonial administration structurally prevented from translating into meaningful authority or ownership, a talent pool that would prove enormously valuable to India's own railway administration after 1947. Some historians point out that the same rail network, once repurposed after independence, became one of the largest employers in the newly sovereign nation and a genuine unifying force across an extraordinarily diverse subcontinent, a complicated legacy that resists any simple verdict of purely good or purely bad. British engineers who designed India's railway network genuinely did produce work of significant technical sophistication, bridges and mountain lines, including the Darjeeling Himalayan Railway, that remain functioning engineering marvels today, a reminder that colonial exploitation and genuine engineering achievement were never mutually exclusive within this history. Indian nationalist writers and politicians in the early 20th century, including figures within the growing independence movement, explicitly cited the railway's role in famine and extraction as part of their broader critique of colonial economic policy, using the network's own statistics against the government that had built it. Rudyard Kipling, whose writing frequently engaged directly with the machinery and administration of British India, described the railway in some of his work with a genuine, complicated affection that sat uneasily beside the extraction and famine so thoroughly documented in the colonial economic record of the same decades. Contemporary Indian Railways, now among the largest employers on Earth, has in recent years funded historical exhibits and museum initiatives that attempt, with mixed but genuine effort, to present the network's full and complicated colonial origin alongside its story as a modern national institution. British parliamentary debates on Indian famine relief from this period preserve in Hansard records, reveal officials openly weighing fiscal orthodoxy against mounting death tolls, a documented moral calculation that modern readers of the transcripts still find genuinely difficult to sit with. It bears repeating plainly that the same rail network blamed for worsening famine also, in less catastrophic years, genuinely did move grain to relieve regional shortages. And this inconsistency is not a contradiction so much as the honest, uncomfortable truth about infrastructure built for extraction, that its capacity could occasionally be turned toward relief, but only when doing so did not meaningfully threaten the underlying colonial economic priorities it was actually designed to serve. The Indian railways of the colonial era also, somewhat paradoxically, became one of the settings in which early Indian nationalist organizing quietly took root. Third-class carriages functioning as one of the few genuinely mixed public spaces where organizers could reach large numbers of ordinary people traveling long distances together. Contemporary economic historians continue to debate the precise proportional blame the railway itself deserves for famine mortality versus broader colonial land and taxation policy, a genuinely unresolved scholarly argument, though virtually none dispute that the network functioned, at minimum, as an efficient enabler of the extraction that worsened these crises. Promontory Summit, Utah, the 10th of May, 1869. 2 locomotives, the Central Pacific's Jupiter and the Union Pacific's number 119, nose to nose on a single line of track, while dignitaries in top hats prepare to drive a ceremonial golden spike into a rail connecting the eastern and western halves of the continent. It is one of the most photographed moments of the 19th century in America and one of the most celebrated. 6 years of brutal construction, over 1,800 miles of track laid across mountains, deserts, and plains, finally joined into a single continuous line. The Central Pacific built east from Sacramento, blasting through the Sierra Nevada mountains with a workforce that was, by the project's peak, more than 90% Chinese immigrant laborers, a fact conspicuously absent from most of the official ceremony photographs taken that day. These men, recruited largely from Guangdong province in southern China, were paid roughly a third less than white laborers doing identical work, forced to provide their own food and lodging while their white counterparts had both covered, and given the deadliest, most dangerous tasks on the entire project. At the summit tunnel through solid granite, Chinese workers were lowered in wicker baskets down sheer cliff faces to drill and place explosive charges, working through Sierra Nevada winters so severe that entire work camps were regularly buried under snow avalanches, killing men whose bodies were sometimes not recovered until the spring thaw. Nobody knows the exact death toll among Chinese railroad workers with any precision, because the Central Pacific kept notoriously incomplete records of Chinese casualties. Estimates from historians range widely, but even conservative figures place the number of dead in the hundreds, with some estimates suggesting well over 1,000. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific pushed west from Omaha, its workforce dominated by Irish immigrants, many of them Civil War veterans on both sides who had traded one brutal, dangerous form of labor for another, laid across the plains at a punishing pace of sometimes several miles of track in a single day. The line the Union Pacific was laying did not run through empty land, whatever the official maps of the era chose to suggest. It ran directly through territory that had sustained native nations, principally the Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Pawnee, for generations beyond counting. Railroad surveyors and construction crews required military escort for a reason. Cheyenne and Lakota warriors attacked construction crews and telegraph lines repeatedly through the late 1860s, a desperate, doomed resistance to a machine that was, quite literally, cutting their homeland in half and inviting an entire continent of settlement in behind it. The railroad's most catastrophic consequence for Plains nations was not the track itself, but what followed it. Hunters riding the new lines specifically to slaughter buffalo for sport and hides, sometimes shooting from the windows of moving passenger cars for entertainment, leaving the carcasses to rot where they fell. The American bison population, estimated at somewhere between 30 and 60 million animals before the railroad era, collapsed to fewer than 1,000 wild animals by the 1880s. This was not incidental damage. Several military and political figures of the era stated openly that destroying the buffalo was the fastest way to force Plains nations onto reservations. General Philip Sheridan reportedly praised buffalo hunters as doing more to solve what officials of the era called the Indian problem than the entire United States Army had managed in years of open conflict. Sit with that sentence for a moment. The extermination of a species was celebrated as a military strategy. At Promontory Summit that May Day in 1869, the ceremony was covered by telegraph wires strung along the very same route, sending the news word by word to celebrating crowds in San Francisco and New York within minutes of the spike being driven. It was, by the technology of its era, an instant global broadcast. Nobody photographed at that ceremony was Chinese, despite Chinese laborers having built the more difficult, more dangerous half of the entire route through the Sierra Nevada. It would take until 2014, 145 years later, for the descendants of those workers to be formally, publicly honored by name at the same location. The Transcontinental Railroad genuinely did knit a fractured, expanding nation together, cutting a journey that once took months by wagon down to about a week by rail. That achievement is real. It sits uncomfortably and permanently beside everything it also destroyed to happen this fast. A Cheyenne elder, according to accounts passed down through several Plains nations, is said to have watched the ceremony from a distance and told those around him that the Iron Road would drink the blood of the buffalo and the people both, and that the land itself would never be quiet again in the same way. Whether or not the words are exact, the prophecy in the decades that followed proved essentially correct. This machine, capable of connecting a continent and devastating it in the same motion, was about to be handed an even larger and more terrible assignment. Within 50 years, the world's railways would be drafted into a war that would use train timetables as literal weapons of mass mobilization. The Central Pacific's owners, a group of Sacramento merchants who became known as the Big Four, grew immensely wealthy from federal land grants and government bonds awarded per mile of track completed, an incentive structure that, much like the Indian guaranteed returns, rewarded speed and volume far more than it rewarded worker welfare. Chinese laborers on the Central Pacific eventually staged a strike in 1867, demanding wages equal to white workers and shorter hours, a remarkably organized action for a workforce with limited legal protection, though the company responded by cutting off food supplies to the strikers rather than negotiating, and the strike collapsed within about a week. Anti-Chinese sentiment in the American West intensified rather than eased after the railroad's completion, culminating in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, a federal law barring further Chinese immigration that stands as a direct and bitter irony given how essential Chinese labor had been to the nation's most celebrated infrastructure achievement just 13 years earlier. Treaties signed between the United States government and Plains nations, including the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, were repeatedly violated as railroad construction and the settlement that followed pushed further into territory those same treaties had formally guaranteed, a pattern of broken agreement that recurred so often it became almost a template. Sitting Bull and other Lakota leaders explicitly identified the railroad as an existential threat to their people's way of life in speeches and councils recorded by contemporaries, understanding with painful clarity, years before the buffalo herds actually collapsed, exactly what this technology was going to cost them. The Central Pacific and Union Pacific crews, racing to lay the most track before the two lines finally met, occasionally sabotaged each other's supply deliveries and surveying stakes, an intense, sometimes almost comically petty corporate rivalry playing out alongside the far more serious human costs of the broader project. Buffalo Bill Cody, whose nickname came directly from his work supplying buffalo meat to railroad construction crews, later built an entire touring stage show around a romanticized version of frontier life, a piece of popular entertainment that helped cement, for generations of Americans, a mythologized version of exactly the history this chapter has just described. Descendants of the Chinese railroad workers organized decades of advocacy to have their ancestors' contributions properly recognized in American history curricula and official commemorations, work that has gradually and only very recently begun to shift how this chapter of the story gets told in American schools. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad triggered an immediate and dramatic surge in westward settlement. Land that had taken wagon trains months to cross now reachable within days, accelerating a demographic transformation of the American West that had been building for decades, but which the railroad compressed into a startlingly short span of years. Contemporary Native American historians and tribal nations have, in recent decades, worked to document and preserve oral histories specifically addressing the railroad's role in this period, ensuring that the perspective largely absent from the celebratory 1869 photographs finally receives the same level of historical documentation as the engineering achievement itself. Surveying crews working ahead of both railroad companies faced genuine physical danger from the terrain itself, mapping routes through country that in many stretches no non-native person had ever formally charted before, work that combined genuine scientific achievement with the unmistakable machinery of dispossession. The golden spike itself, the actual ceremonial object rather than the ordinary iron spike quietly substituted and immediately afterward, survives today in a university archive in California, a small, oddly modest artifact for an object so thoroughly mythologized in the American national story of westward expansion and manifest destiny. The final push to complete the transcontinental line saw both companies racing at a pace that later engineering reviews described as recklessly fast, with some sections requiring substantial rework within just a few years of opening, a direct physical legacy of the competitive urgency that had driven the entire project. The completion ceremony's famous photograph, endlessly reproduced in American textbooks for generations afterward, has itself become a subject of historical scrutiny, scholars pointing out exactly whose faces are present in the frame, and, just as tellingly, whose are not, a single image doing as much to shape popular memory as any written account of the day. Berlin, the summer of 1914. In a room lined with maps, German general staff officers pore over railway timetables with an intensity that outstrips anything they're giving to actual battle plans, because in this particular war, the timetable essentially is the battle plan. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's strategy for a rapid knockout blow against France before turning to face Russia, depended entirely on the precise, minute-by-minute movement of railway rolling stock, an estimated 11,000 trains required to mobilize and position roughly 1.5 million soldiers within a matter of weeks. The terrifying detail, the one military historians keep returning to, is that once mobilization began, it became almost impossible to stop or slow it without the entire system collapsing into chaos on the tracks. Trains moving toward each other on shared lines, troops stranded without supply, an army half-assembled and entirely useless. This meant that a diplomatic crisis in July 1914 was, to a significant and well-documented degree, decided by railway logistics rather than pure political will. Kaiser Wilhelm II reportedly asked his generals, quite late in the crisis, whether mobilization could simply be redirected east instead of west. He was told, essentially, that the trains did not allow for that kind of improvisation. Once the war began, railways did not stop mattering. If anything, they became more central because the Western Front settled almost immediately into a static, industrial siege that consumed men, shells, and supplies at a rate no army in history had ever needed to sustain. Standard gauge lines carried troops and heavy artillery up to within a few miles of the front. From there, an entire secondary network of narrow-gauge trench railways, some tracks laid overnight by exhausted engineering companies, carried shells, food, barbed wire, and replacement soldiers the final agonizing distance into the mud. The scale of what these trench railways moved is genuinely staggering. During the preparation for the Battle of the Somme in 1916 alone, British forces stockpiled well over 1 million artillery shells, virtually all of them transported to the front by rail before the offensive even began. And the trains ran the other direction too. Purpose-built ambulance trains, some converted from luxury passenger stock, others built new with hanging cot systems to reduce jolting for the wounded, carried an estimated 2.5 million injured British soldiers alone back from the front over the course of the war. Nurses aboard these ambulance trains described journeys lasting many hours through the night, tending to men with wounds that modern medicine, even now, would consider catastrophic, doing what they could with limited supplies while the train rattled on toward a coastal hospital or a hospital ship. The efficiency of it all is precisely what makes it so disturbing to look back on. Railway logistics allowed the belligerent nations of Europe to sustain an unprecedented, mechanized slaughter for 4 straight years, resupplying the killing with the same disciplined precision that the Victorians once used to sell railway travel as safe, modern, and civilized. Roughly 10 million soldiers died across the First World War, alongside a comparable number of civilians, and the railway, that great symbol of 19th century progress, had become the circulatory system feeding an entirely new, entirely mechanized kind of death. It is worth pausing here, because in the middle of this industrial horror, an oddly glamorous counterstory was also unfolding on parallel tracks, quite literally. Long-distance luxury expresses kept running through much of the interwar period that followed. Carriages of polished walnut and crystal gliding through a Europe still trying to forget what it had just survived. Passengers on these trains dressed for dinner in linen and jewels while, in many cases, the very landscape sliding past their windows still bore visible scars, shattered forests, unmarked graves, entire towns rebuilt from rubble along routes the trenches had once crossed. This contrast, unbearable weight sitting right beside unbearable elegance, is where our story goes next. Because the most beautiful train in the world was not simply a train. It was also, quietly and deliberately, a moving corridor for espionage, political intrigue, and more than one assassination plot. The armistice ending the First World War, incidentally, was itself signed inside a railway carriage in the Compiègne forest of France on the 11th of November, 1918, a detail that says everything about how completely the railway had become entangled with the century's violence. Even the peace was signed on rails. So as the guns fell silent, the trains kept running, into a strange, glittering, uneasy decade where the same tracks that had carried shells to the front were now carrying diplomats, spies, and heiresses across a continent that had not yet finished counting its dead. France and Russia had their own elaborate mobilization timetables that shaped their strategic thinking every bit as much as Germany's, and the interlocking, competing rigidity of all these national rail schedules is one of the specific technical reasons historians point to when explaining why the July crisis of 1914 proved so difficult to de-escalate once it began. Railway workers themselves were mobilized alongside soldiers in several combatant nations, with experienced engine drivers and signalmen, sometimes exempted from frontline combat specifically because their technical skill running the military supply network was considered too valuable to risk in the trenches. Field railways built directly behind the front lines used a bewildering variety of gauges, and rolling stock improvised from whatever materials armies could scavenge. Engineering solutions thrown together under artillery fire that would have been unthinkably reckless in peacetime construction. The sheer tonnage moved by rail during the war reshaped entire national economies, with Britain's railway companies effectively placed under direct government control for the duration of the conflict, a nationalization experiment that quietly previewed the post-war debate about public versus private ownership of railways that followed for decades. Ambulance train crews, many of them women serving as nurses and orderlies for the first time in large numbers in this specific wartime role, described the work as an unrelenting blur of blood, disinfectant, and the particular sound of a train slowing for yet another station where more wounded waited on stretchers along the platform. The concept of total war, in which an entire nation's industrial and logistical capacity is mobilized for the war effort, owes a significant debt to the railway's demonstrated ability to move men and material at unprecedented scale, a template military planners across the 20th century studied and refined long after 1918. Britain's railway companies, though nominally still privately owned during the war, operated under a railway executive committee that coordinated their operations essentially as a single national system, a wartime arrangement that fueled post-war political arguments about whether the railways should simply remain nationalized permanently. The armistice carriage itself, preserved after the war as a monument to French victory, was later deliberately used by Adolf Hitler in 1940 for the signing of France's surrender. The exact same railway car brought out specifically to inflict a symbolic humiliation, a detail that captures with unsettling clarity just how deeply railways have become entangled with the theater of European power. Railway timetable printing itself became a wartime industrial operation in its own right, with specialized presses running continuously to produce the constantly revised schedules that mobilization and later frontline supply required. Paperwork as essential to the war machine as any rifle or shell. Historians of the First World War continue to debate exactly how much independent agency political leaders retained once railway mobilization began, a genuinely unresolved scholarly question that matters enormously, because it asks whether the war's opening weeks represent a failure of human judgment, or a failure baked directly into the machinery those humans had built and then found they could no longer fully control. The specific German term Eisenbahn, meaning iron road, took on an almost sinister double meaning by the war's end, a piece of ordinary vocabulary now permanently associated for an entire generation of Europeans with both national pride and unimaginable industrial slaughter. Railway workers on all sides of the conflict were, in a grim irony historians have noted, sometimes more essential to their nation war effort than the soldiers whose mobilization they enabled, yet received comparatively little of the memorial attention granted to combat veterans in the decades that followed. A walnut-paneled sleeping carriage rolls through the mountains of the Balkans sometime in the 1920s, and in one of its private compartments, a gloved hand slides a folded note across a linen tablecloth to a man who has been introduced, falsely, under someone else's name. This is not a novelist's invention, or not entirely. The Orient Express, running from Paris to Constantinople from 1883 onward, and rebuilt into new configurations through the interwar years, genuinely was used by intelligence services from multiple nations as a convenient, discreet, and fast route across a continent bristling with borders and secrets. The train's clientele included royalty traveling under assumed names, arms dealers, diplomats carrying documents they were not supposed to be carrying, and at least a few individuals later confirmed, through declassified records, to have been working directly for European intelligence agencies during exactly this period. The novelist Agatha Christie rode the line repeatedly on her way to and from archaeological digs in the Middle East with her second husband, and drew directly on both the claustrophobic elegance of the carriages and the very real, well-documented undercurrent of intrigue for her 1934 novel, which needs no introduction here. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the Flying Scotsman was setting its own kind of record, completing the non-stop run from London to Edinburgh in 1928, a genuine engineering triumph that captured public imagination in a way that briefly let an anxious post-war Britain feel proud of speed again. These famous named trains, the Orient Express, the Flying Scotsman, South Africa's Blue Train launched in this same interwar period, were marketed as the absolute pinnacle of modern travel. And in terms of sheer physical comfort for the passengers who could afford a ticket, they largely delivered on that promise. Dining cars served multiple course meals prepared fresh on board by chefs trained in Paris, poured from crystal decanters that somehow survived the vibration of a train traveling at speeds that would have terrified passengers just 2 generations earlier. It was quite deliberately a fantasy of stability sold to a continent that had very recently proven how unstable everything actually was. But the intrigue was not incidental to the glamour. It was woven directly into it. The relative privacy of a sleeping compartment, the ease of crossing multiple national borders without the scrutiny given to slower forms of travel, made these trains genuinely attractive to people conducting business that could not survive daylight. There is documented history here worth taking seriously, not just cinematic legend. European intelligence services of the interwar period did use long-distance rail lines, the Orient Express prominent among them, as informal channels for courier work and clandestine meetings, precisely because the trains crossed so many jurisdictions in a single overnight journey. At least one documented assassination plot from this era involved a target boarding a long-distance European express, and multiple political killings and near misses across the 1920s and 1930s took place at or near major continental railway stations, which functioned as choke points where a target's schedule became, briefly, entirely predictable. And all the while, the Elegance itself was arguably a kind of collective denial. Europe in the 1920s and early 1930s was rebuilding from a war that had killed an entire generation of young men, carrying enormous unresolved trauma, unstable new borders, and unpaid reparations debts that were quietly poisoning the continent's economies. Riding the Orient Express in first class, sipping champagne through the mountains of a continent still full of unmarked mass graves from the war just ended, was, whether any single passenger consciously framed it this way, an act of studied, luxurious forgetting. That forgetting had a shelf life, and everyone alive at the time, on some level, knew it. The same railway network that had carried mobilization orders in 1914 was quietly being surveyed again in the 1930s, this time by planners working for a regime that had risen out of exactly the resentment and economic collapse that decade of denial had failed to address. By the mid to late 1930s, the same tracks carrying honeymooning couples and diplomats in silk pajamas were also, in parallel and largely unremarked, being resurveyed, reinforced, and in some cases re-gauged in preparation for a mobilization that would dwarf anything the timetables of 1914 had managed. The elegant, glittering interwar railway story does not end with a dramatic derailment or a single catastrophic headline. It simply, quietly gets absorbed. By 1939, the luxury sleeping cars of the Orient Express had in some cases been requisitioned for military use, and the network that once symbolized decadent freedom of movement was about to be turned toward the single darkest purpose in the entire history of railways. Because within just a few years, an ordinary, unremarkable cattle car, coupled onto an ordinary, scheduled train, will become the instrument of a genocide carried out with the same meticulous, disciplined efficiency that had once been the railway industry's proudest achievement. The Orient Express itself was, at various points across its history, briefly suspended or rerouted due to political instability in the Balkans, a region so consistently volatile through the early 20th century that railway timetables occasionally had to be rewritten around shifting borders and active conflicts in something close to real time. Wagons Litz, the company operating most of Europe's great sleeper trains, employed a genuinely international staff of conductors trained to a famously exacting standard of discretion, expected to notice everything about their passengers while appearing to notice absolutely nothing, a professional posture perfectly suited to a train that so often carried secrets. The interwar years also saw genuine technical innovation in long-distance travel comfort, including improved suspension systems specifically designed to let passengers write, read, and dine without the jarring vibration that had made earlier long journeys genuinely exhausting, refinements that fed directly into the train's reputation for effortless glamour. Several European royal families used these luxury lines regularly for private, unpublicized travel, and railway staff were bound by strict confidentiality, meaning the true guest list of any given Orient Express journey in this era is, in more than a few cases, simply lost to history entirely. The Blue Train in South Africa carried a similarly glamorous but complicated legacy, offering luxury travel through a landscape shaped by its own colonial history, its opulent carriages a stark visual contrast to the conditions many black South African laborers who maintained the line experienced under the era's segregationist policies. Railway hotels, built by major companies at key stations across Europe and the British Empire alike, extended this same interwar culture of engineered elegance beyond the train itself, creating an entire hospitality ecosystem designed to make the wealthy traveler feel cocooned in comfort from departure to arrival. The interwar romance of the great named expresses has proven remarkably durable in popular culture, inspiring films, novels, and later video games decades after the actual trains themselves stopped running in their original glamorous form, a testament to just how completely this particular railway image captured the 20th century imagination. Restoration enthusiasts have, in recent decades, returned several original wagons Litz carriages to operational condition, allowing a small number of modern travelers to experience something close to the genuine texture of interwar luxury rail travel, walnut paneling and all, on preserved heritage runs across Europe. It is worth remembering that not every passenger on these glamorous interwar expresses was wealthy by birth. A number of the era's most successful entertainers, writers, and self-made business people used exactly this kind of visible luxury travel as a deliberate, calculated signal of their own arrival into a social class that had not, until very recently, been open to them at all. It is genuinely difficult, looking back from the present, to fully separate the real documented espionage history of these interwar expresses from the layers of fiction and myth that have since been built on top of it, and perhaps that blending itself, fact and legend traveling together in the same sleeping car, is the most honest way to understand how this era has been remembered. The eventual decline of these named luxury expresses through the middle of the 20th century, hastened by cheaper air travel and the economic disruption of the Second World War, marked the quiet close of an era that, in hindsight, occupied a remarkably narrow window of roughly 5 decades between its glamorous peak and its practical obsolescence. Somewhere on a line east of Warsaw, sometime in 1942, a cattle car built to hold 8 horses is carrying somewhere between 60 and 100 human beings, packed standing with no water, no toilet, and no light beyond what leaks through gaps in the wooden slats. Inside, a child is singing, very quietly, a lullaby her grandmother taught her in Yiddish, a language an entire continent's murderous ideology is, at this exact moment, trying to erase from the earth along with everyone who speaks it. This is the Deutsche Reichsbahn, Germany's state railway, and by 1942, it had become the essential logistical machine of the Holocaust, transporting an estimated 3 million Jewish people, along with Roma people, political prisoners, and others to ghettos, concentration camps, and extermination camps across occupied Europe. The organization behind this was not improvised chaos. It was, disturbingly, standard German railway bureaucracy, applied without modification to an entirely new category of cargo. The same scheduling offices that ran ordinary passenger and freight traffic simply added deportation trains to their timetables as another line item. Historians who have studied the surviving Reichsbahn documents describe a system of genuinely chilling banality. Requests for rolling stock, invoices, correspondence between camp administrators and railway officials about scheduling conflicts, as though the trains in question were carrying freight rather than human beings being sent to die. The Reichsbahn billed for these transports on a per-kilometer, per-head basis, the same accounting method used for any ordinary freight shipment, with reduced rates negotiated for children and, according to surviving records, no charge at all for those too young to require a full fare. The paperwork survives. Historians have read it and had to sit with what it meant. Adolf Eichmann, the SS officer most directly responsible for coordinating deportation logistics, treated the scheduling of these trains as a genuine bureaucratic priority, at times competing directly with German military rail traffic for scarce locomotives and rolling stock, particularly as the war turned against Germany from 1943 onward. This detail matters more than it might first appear. Even as Germany was losing the war, even as military commanders desperately needed every train for troop movements and supply, deportation trains to Auschwitz-Birkenau and other extermination camps continued running, sometimes given priority that arguably undermined Germany's own military position. The killing mattered more than the war. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest of the extermination camps, was purpose-built with a rail spur running directly into the camp itself, completed in 1944, allowing arriving trains to unload prisoners within walking distance of the gas chambers, eliminating what camp administrators apparently viewed as an inefficient delay in the previous arrangement. That image, the famous photograph of the rail line running directly beneath the guard tower and through the main gate of Birkenau, has become one of the most recognizable and devastating symbols of the entire Holocaust, precisely because it shows, without any need for further explanation, exactly what the railway had been turned into. Survivors who lived through these transports describe journeys lasting days in some cases, without food or water, standing in their own waste, with the elderly and infants dying en route with terrible regularity, their bodies left among the living until the doors were finally opened at the destination. Some Reichsbahn employees, it is documented, understood at least some portion of what these trains were ultimately for. Others maintained, in post-war testimony, a claimed ignorance that historians have found difficult to fully credit given the sheer administrative visibility of the operation across German railway offices for years. After the war, prosecution of Reichsbahn officials specifically for their role in the deportations proved remarkably limited compared to the scale of their institutional participation, a legal and moral reckoning that many historians consider one of the significant unfinished pieces of post-war justice. Germany's National Railway Company, in its modern form as Deutsche Bahn, formally acknowledged this history decades later, funding memorial projects and historical research into the Reichsbahn's role, an institutional reckoning that arrived, as these things so often do, generations after most of the people directly responsible had died. It is worth saying plainly, without hedging, what makes this chapter different from every other dark chapter in this series. The other horrors in this story, the Navvy deaths, the colonial famines, the forced labor camps, were largely byproducts of greed, negligence, or imperial control. This was purpose-built. The railway here was not incidental to the atrocity. It was the engineering solution to it. There is no way to move from this chapter into the rest of the railway's history without carrying its weight forward. And the very next chapter does not offer relief. In the jungles of Southeast Asia, at almost exactly this same moment in history, another empire was building another railway on almost exactly the same foundation of expendable human life. Some Reichsbahn officials and engineers involved in the deportation logistics were, after the war, quietly reintegrated into West German railway administration during the post-war Reconstruction period. Their wartime roles either undisclosed or treated with a leniency that historians studying denazification have found genuinely troubling. Rail unions and railway workers in several occupied countries, including notably in Poland and France, engaged in acts of sabotage against German transport infrastructure during the war, including, in a number of documented cases, deliberate slowdowns or disruptions aimed specifically at deportation trains, a form of resistance that carried extraordinary personal risk. Surviving testimony from Holocaust survivors who endured these transports frequently describes the disorientation of arrival, stepping off a train after days without food, water, or light directly into the chaos and violence of a camp selection process, the abrupt transition from one horror to another with no pause between them. Historical research into the Reichsbahn's finances has shown the organization operated the deportation network at a genuine profit for years, a detail that continues to strike scholars and the public alike as one of the coldest, most administratively grotesque facts to emerge from the entire historical record of the Holocaust. Righteous individuals within the railway systems of occupied Europe, though tragically rare, did exist, including railway workers who deliberately falsified paperwork or delayed specific trains at enormous personal risk, quiet acts of resistance that saved lives in ways that rarely made it into official post-war accounts. The scale of the Reichsbahn's rolling stock dedicated to deportation, thousands of freight cars repurposed across the war years, represented a genuinely significant diversion of resources that some historians argue meaningfully hampered German military logistics in the war's final years, meaning the ideology of genocide was, by the regime's own admission in internal documents, treated as a higher priority than winning the war itself. Memorial museums built at former campsites, including Auschwitz-Birkenau itself, now preserve sections of original rail track and even surviving freight cars as central, deliberately unflinching exhibits, physical objects that curators have found convey the scale and mechanism of the atrocity in ways that written testimony alone, however powerful, sometimes cannot fully achieve. The specific bureaucratic language used in surviving Reichsbahn correspondence, careful, procedural, entirely devoid of any acknowledgement of what was actually being transported, has become a specific subject of study for scholars examining how ordinary institutional language can be used to psychologically distance participants from atrocity. Contemporary Holocaust education programs in Germany now specifically incorporate the Reichsbahn's logistical role into school curricula, a deliberate pedagogical choice to ensure that the mechanism of the atrocity, not just its ideology, is fully understood by younger generations who will one day be responsible for maintaining this history's memory once the last living survivors and witnesses are gone. Yad Vashem and other Holocaust memorial institutions have devoted substantial ongoing research specifically to reconstructing individual deportation train schedules and passenger manifests where they survive, painstaking work aimed at restoring names and specific journeys to victims who were, in the official Reichsbahn paperwork, reduced to nothing more than a head count and a per-kilometer fare. Wiesel, Levi, and other Holocaust survivors who later became prominent writers each described, in their own distinct voices, the specific sensory horror of the transport itself, the darkness, the thirst, the impossible density of bodies, as being in some ways as psychologically devastating as anything that followed at the camps, a first, deliberate stage of dehumanization built directly into the journey. Deep in the jungle of what was then Siam, in 1943, a prisoner of war drives a spike into a wooden sleeper he knows will likely rot within a year in the tropical damp. And he also knows, with a bleaker certainty, that for every length of track laid on this line, at least one man working beside him will not survive to see it used. This is the Burma-Siam Railway. Later given the name it is remembered by today, the Death Railway, built by the Imperial Japanese Army between 1942 and 1943 to supply Japanese forces in Burma, without relying on vulnerable sea routes that Allied submarines had made increasingly deadly. The workforce was drawn from two sources. Roughly 60,000 Allied prisoners of war, captured after the fall of Singapore and other Southeast Asian campaigns, British, Australian, Dutch, and American among them, and a far larger number, estimated between 180,000 and 250,000, of Asian civilian laborers, known by the Japanese term Ramusha, drawn largely from Malaya, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. The engineering demand was brutal on its own terms. Over 250 miles of track through dense jungle, mountainous terrain, and river crossings, originally estimated by peacetime engineers to require around 5 years of construction. The Japanese military command demanded it completed in approximately 1. To meet that timeline, laborers worked in what survivors consistently described as speedo periods, stretches of 18 or more hours of continuous labor, driven by guards using physical violence against anyone who slowed the pace, regardless of injury, illness, or simple exhaustion. Rations for both POWs and Ramusha workers were catastrophically inadequate, typically a small allocation of rice with little else, providing a fraction of the calories required for the physical labor being demanded. Malnutrition-related illness became not the exception, but essentially the universal condition of everyone on the line. Cholera outbreaks tore through the labor camps with horrifying speed, in conditions with no clean water and no functioning sanitation, killing men within a day of the first symptoms in the worst outbreaks, while tropical ulcers, left untreated, ate down a bone on limbs that camp medical officers, themselves prisoners with almost no supplies, sometimes had to amputate with tools no better than a sharpened kitchen knife. The most notorious single section of the line was the Hellfire Pass cutting, a stretch of solid rock that had to be excavated almost entirely by hand, with prisoners working around the clock under torchlight, the flickering flames against the rock face giving the cutting its lasting name. Estimates of the total death toll on the Burma-Siam Railway are, even now, imprecise because Japanese record-keeping for the Ramusha workers in particular was minimal to non-existent. The most widely cited figures suggest roughly 12,000 Allied POWs died, alongside somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 Asian laborers, a death toll for the Ramusha that is proportionally, and in raw numbers, even more devastating than the POW toll that Western histories tended to foreground for decades. The bridge over the Mekong River, later renamed the Kwai to match the fame brought by the 1957 film that fictionalized this history, became the most internationally recognizable single structure on the line, though the film itself, worth noting plainly, took enormous dramatic liberties and largely erased the Ramusha experience from the story entirely. Real accounts from POW survivors, many recorded decades later in painstaking oral history projects, describe men continuing to work while suffering from beriberi, dysentery, and malaria simultaneously, because refusal or collapse meant beatings that could themselves be fatal, and because their own sense of duty to keep their fellow prisoners alive through mutual effort somehow outlasted their own physical limits. The line was completed in October 1943, roughly on the accelerated schedule the Japanese command had demanded, at a human cost that, when properly totaled, including the Ramusha workers so long left out of the popular memory, ranks among the deadliest single construction projects of the 20th century relative to its length. After the war, much of the line was dismantled or simply abandoned to the jungle, which reclaimed most of its length within a generation. Vines and root systems pulling apart embankments that had cost so many lives to build, until only isolated preserved sections remain today, maintained specifically as memorial sites. War cemeteries at Kanchanaburi and Chiang Kai in Thailand hold thousands of the identified Allied dead. Rows of white markers in immaculate, quiet gardens that stand in stark, deliberate contrast to the violence of what happened along this line. But there is no equivalent cemetery, no equivalent formal memorial for the vast majority of the Ramusha who died. Their graves, where they exist at all, remain largely unmarked, their names largely unrecorded, in a jungle that has spent 80 years quietly erasing the evidence. That asymmetry, in whose deaths get marble headstones and whose deaths get silence, is not unique to this railway. It is, in fact, a pattern this entire series keeps circling back to, and it does not disappear after the war ends. It simply changes location, changes ideology, and finds new victims. Because within just a few years of Japan's surrender, an entirely different empire on an entirely different continent would be building its own railways through its own frozen wilderness, using its own captive population, under a flag that claimed to represent liberation while running on rails built by men who had none. Medical officers among the Allied prisoners, doctors who were themselves captives with almost no supplies, are remembered with particular reverence in survivor accounts for performing surgeries, including amputations, using instruments improvised from mess tins and boiled bamboo, saving lives through sheer ingenuity under conditions that should have made survival impossible. The Japanese engineers overseeing construction operated under direct pressure from Imperial General Headquarters to meet a schedule that left essentially no margin for illness, weather, or terrain difficulty. A command structure that treated the human cost of the deadline as an acceptable, even unremarkable, operational expense. Post-war war crimes tribunals in the region did convict a number of Japanese officers and guards specifically for their conduct during the railway's construction, though many historians and survivor advocates have argued for decades that the scale of prosecution never came close to matching the true scale of the suffering involved. Local Thai and Burmese communities living near the railway's route in the decades since have, in various ways, incorporated the line's history into regional memory, some sections now serving as sober memorial tourism sites that attempt, with mixed success, to properly honor the Ramusha alongside the more internationally famous POW story. Survivors of the Death Railway who returned home after the war frequently described decades of difficulty discussing their experiences even with close family, a common pattern among trauma survivors of this era, before oral history projects beginning in the 1980s and 1990s finally created structure opportunities for many to speak in detail for the first time. Engineering surveys conducted after the war found that significant portions of the original railway had been built to standards so hastily compromised that sections would likely have failed structurally within a few years, even without deliberate post-war demolition, underscoring just how much the schedule had been prioritized over anything resembling sound construction practice. The jungle sections of the original Death Railway that have been preserved as heritage sites now attract both dedicated historical tourists and, occasionally, descendants of the men who died there, making pilgrimages that combine grief, remembrance, and a determined effort to ensure this history is not allowed to simply fade the way the tracks themselves so nearly did. Engineering historians studying the Death Railway note that several of its bridges and cuttings, despite the horrific circumstances of their construction, demonstrated genuine technical ingenuity, a fact that sits uncomfortably but honestly alongside the death toll, since skill and atrocity were never mutually exclusive on this line. The word Ramusha itself, once a bureaucratic Japanese administrative term with no particular emotional weight, has since become, within Southeast Asian historical memory, a word carrying the full, specific grief of an entire category of forced laborers whose individual names and stories were, for decades, almost entirely absent from how this history was told outside the region. The Australian War Memorial and similar institutions in Britain and the Netherlands maintain extensive archives specifically documenting the Death Railway experience of their own POWs, archives that in recent decades have increasingly been expanded and cross-referenced with Southeast Asian historical research to build a more complete picture of the Ramusha experience as well. Comparative historians studying 20th century forced labor infrastructure projects, from the Death Railway to the Soviet Gulag lines to come, note a consistent, chilling pattern across otherwise unrelated regimes, that deadline pressure imposed from a political or military command structure far removed from the actual construction site reliably produces the highest human cost of all. A station master in a small Yorkshire village turns a key in a waiting room door for the final time, sometime in the mid-1960s, and the click of the lock is, for this particular building, the last sound it will ever make in official service. Down the platform, weeds are already working their way up through gaps in the flagstones. This scene repeated itself, with only minor variation, across thousands of small stations throughout Britain during the 1960s, following a report published in 1963 by Dr. Richard Beeching, chairman of British Railways, formally titled The Reshaping of British Railways, though almost everyone simply called it, and still calls it, the Beeching Report. Beeching's analysis found that a huge proportion of Britain's rail network, particularly rural branch lines, was carrying only a small fraction of total passenger traffic while consuming a disproportionate share of the system's costs. His recommendation, delivered with the cool detachment of an accountant rather than a railway man, was blunt: close them. Roughly 5,000 miles of railway line and over 2,000 stations were closed across Britain following the Beeching cuts, implemented through the mid to late 1960s, reshaping the map of rural transport in ways that many communities are, quite genuinely, still feeling the consequences of today. For villages that lost their station, the closure rarely meant a minor inconvenience. It often meant the practical end of easy access to jobs, hospitals, and markets in nearby towns, accelerating rural depopulation in areas that had, for a century, organized daily life around the rhythm of the timetable. Steam traction itself was fading simultaneously for entirely separate reasons of efficiency and cost, replaced across the 1950s and 1960s by diesel and electric locomotives that required far less maintenance, far less manual labor, and produced none of the romantic plumes of smoke and steam that had defined the railway's public image for well over a century. British Railways officially ended regular steam operation in August 1968, a date that railway enthusiasts across the country still mark with something close to genuine mourning, gathering along trackside embankments for a final run they knew, even as they watched it, they were witnessing for the very last time. The sound itself is worth pausing on, because it genuinely is gone now in ordinary service. The chuff of a steam locomotive under load, the particular hiss of a safety valve releasing pressure, the smell of hot oil and coal smoke drifting across a platform. An entire sensory world present in daily life for a century and a half, simply stopped. Similar contractions were happening across much of the industrialized world through these same decades, as automobiles and expanding highway networks, heavily subsidized by post-war governments eager to promote car ownership, pulled passengers away from railways that had once been the only practical way to travel any real distance. In the United States, passenger rail mileage and ridership collapsed even more dramatically than in Britain across the same period. Private railroad companies abandoning unprofitable passenger routes wholesale, a decline so severe that Congress eventually created Amtrak in 1971 largely to prevent intercity passenger rail from disappearing in America altogether. Signal boxes across Britain, once staffed around the clock by signalmen who knew every curve and gradient of their section personally, fell silent one by one as centralized electronic signaling replaced them, leaving small brick and timber buildings standing empty beside tracks that, in some cases, no longer carried any traffic at all. There's a particular kind of grief in this chapter that differs from the violent tragedies earlier in this series. Nobody died in the Beeching cuts, not directly. What died instead was something harder to name precisely, a whole texture of communal life organized around a station clock, a level crossing, a weekly market day timed to the arrival of the milk train. Some closed lines have found new life as heritage railways, lovingly restored by volunteer enthusiasts who maintain steam locomotives and preserve stations purely for their own sake, running short services for tourists rather than commuters, a kind of museum that keeps moving rather than sitting still. Others became long-distance walking and cycling paths, their old embankments and cuttings repurposed into what Britain now calls greenways, a second life for infrastructure that, whatever its original purpose, at least gets to remain useful rather than simply crumbling into the hedgerows unnoticed. But the great majority of what beaching closed simply vanished into the landscape. Bridges demolished for road safety, cuttings filled in for agricultural use, stations converted into private homes with the platforms still faintly visible under a modern garden. A whole geography quietly erased within a single working lifetime. This decline, driven by economics and changing technology in the democratic West, was not the only story unfolding on the world's railways during these same decades. Elsewhere, an entirely different regime was still actively building new lines, not to connect communities, but to feed an entirely different and far crueler kind of system. Beeching himself, in later interviews, expressed some frustration that his report had been implemented in a narrowly financial way that ignored the social and economic recommendations he had also included, arguing that policymakers had taken the closures and largely discarded his companion proposals for improving the lines that remained. Rail enthusiast societies formed rapidly across Britain in direct response to the closures, working to preserve locomotives, rolling stock, and in some cases entire short lines that would otherwise have been scrapped entirely, a grassroots preservation movement that remains remarkably active and well organized to this day. Several closed branch lines have, decades later, actually been reopened as demand patterns shifted and local campaigners successfully argued that the original closure decisions had underestimated future population growth and environmental considerations that simply were not part of the calculation in the 1960s. The specific sound and smell of steam operation is preserved today largely through these volunteer heritage lines, meaning an entire sensory experience that briefly seemed destined to vanish permanently from British life has instead survived, carefully maintained, as something closer to living history than pure nostalgia. Model railway hobbyists in Britain experienced something of a boom during exactly this period of real-world decline, an entire generation recreating in miniature in spare bedrooms and lofts across the country the branch lines and steam locomotives that were disappearing in full-scale reality just outside their windows. Some closed stations found unexpected second lives as private residences, art galleries, or small local museums. Their platforms and waiting rooms repurposed by owners who often went to considerable lengths to preserve original architectural details, a grassroots form of heritage preservation operating entirely outside official channels. Economic historians studying the beaching era have noted that some of the closures, viewed with the benefit of decades of hindsight and changing transport patterns, genuinely did reflect sound decisions given the traffic data available at the time, complicating the simpler popular narrative that frames the cuts purely as short-sighted vandalism against rural Britain. Local campaigns to save specific threatened branch lines during the beaching era occasionally succeeded, and the surviving settled to Carlisle line stands as one of the most celebrated examples, saved in the 1980s by a public campaign that argued successfully for both its scenic and practical value. Beeching's own background as an executive at ICI, a chemical company entirely outside the railway industry, was itself controversial at the time of his appointment, critics arguing that a man with no direct railway operating experience was fundamentally unsuited to make decisions with such profound social consequences for communities he had never actually lived in or depended upon. Britain's post-war railway nationalization in 1948, which created British Railways in the first place, was itself a genuinely contested political decision, and the beaching cuts less than 2 decades later can be understood partly as a consequence of that earlier nationalization, now confronting the harder, less popular financial realities of running a unified national network. For every community that successfully campaigned to save a threatened line, several more simply lacked the organizational resources or political connections to mount an effective challenge, meaning the pattern of which branch lines survived beaching often had as much to do with local advocacy capacity as with the underlying traffic numbers themselves. Somewhere in the frozen taiga of eastern Siberia, Sometime in the early 1930s, a train carrying several hundred prisoners rumbles slowly toward the Kolyma region, a place so remote and so brutally cold that it would become, within a decade, virtually synonymous in the Russian language with the very worst the Gulag system had to offer. The Soviet Gulag, an acronym for the state agency administering the forced labor camp system, used prisoner labor to build railways across some of the harshest terrain on the planet, including lines through permafrost that engineers under normal conditions would have considered barely feasible without decades of preparation. The BM line, the Baikal-Amur main line, and earlier the infamous sail car to Agarka Railway, sometimes called the Dead Road by survivors and historians, were built substantially or entirely by prisoner labor, under conditions where the line between construction project and slow, deliberate execution was, by design, very thin indeed. Estimates of the total number of prisoners who passed through Gulag labor camps across the Soviet era range widely among historians, but the figures for those who died specifically during railway construction projects run into the tens of thousands for individual lines, with the Dead Road alone estimated to have killed somewhere between 50 and 100,000 prisoners in a project that, after Stalin's death in 1953, was simply abandoned unfinished. The engineering logic of using forced labor in temperatures that regularly dropped below -40 degrees was, from the perspective of the state, brutally simple. Prisoners were considered an expendable resource, and the political value of demonstrating relentless industrial progress, regardless of the human cost, mattered more to the regime than the economic sense of the projects themselves, several of which never carried a single ton of freight after completion. Survivor accounts, many recorded only after the fall of the Soviet Union, made such testimony safer to give, describe working in threadbare clothing entirely inadequate for the climate, on rations calculated with clinical precision to keep a laborer alive just long enough to be economically useful, and no longer. The permafrost itself became an unintentional gravekeeper. Bodies buried in ground that never fully thaws are preserved rather than decomposing normally. And in the decades since, researchers and journalists visiting former campsites along abandoned rail routes have documented the eerie, undeniable physical evidence of exactly how many people this system consumed. A remarkably similar pattern, forced labor deployed for railway and broader infrastructure construction as an instrument of political control, emerged under Mao Zedong's government in China during the mid-20th century, and later under the totalitarian state built by the Kim dynasty in North Korea, both regimes drawing, whether consciously or not, on very similar Stalinist templates of labor as punishment and industrial output as propaganda. In North Korea specifically, human rights organizations and defector testimony collected over recent decades describe political prison camps, known within the system as Kwanliso, where forced labor on railway maintenance and construction projects continues to this day, according to satellite imagery analysis and survivor accounts gathered by international monitoring groups. What unites all of these systems, separated by decades and geography and ostensibly opposed ideologies, is a chillingly consistent underlying calculation. The railway line itself, an object celebrated throughout most of the series as a symbol of connection and progress, becomes here a conveyor belt with a very different, very deliberate destination, the camp, and ultimately, for many, the grave. It is worth being precise about the moral distinction between the earlier chapters of exploitation in this series, and this one specifically. The Victorian navvies died largely from negligence and cost-cutting. The colonial and death railway victims died from a calculated indifference to human life in the pursuit of empire and war. The Gulag and its imitators represent something more deliberate still, forced labor and death as an explicit tool of the state's political control over its own citizens. Russia today maintains parts of the BM line as a functioning, if still economically marginal, freight corridor, its origins in forced labor acknowledged in some official histories and memorial projects, and quietly minimized or omitted in others, depending entirely on which government institution happens to be telling the story. Small, scattered memorial markers exist at some former campsites along these routes today, placed largely through the efforts of independent historical societies and survivor groups, rather than sustained state initiative. Modest stones in vast, silent, frozen landscapes that absorbed so much suffering with so little external witness for so many decades. This is, in many ways, the last of the truly dark human labor stories in our chronology, though certainly not the last dark story overall. From here, the railway's relationship with human suffering starts to shift away from the deliberate cruelty of forced construction and towards something quieter, more technological, more psychological, and in its own way, no less unsettling. Because at almost the exact same moment prisoners were dying on the dead road in Siberia, Japanese engineers on the other side of the globe were beginning to design something entirely new, a train built not for cargo, not for empire, not for war, but purely, single-mindedly for speed itself and for a very different, more disorienting kind of consequence. Solzhenitsyn's writing, drawing on his own years as a prisoner in the Gulag system, brought detailed, harrowing testimony about forced labor conditions to a global audience for the first time in the 1960s and 1970s, work that Soviet authorities suppressed domestically for decades, even as it reshaped international understanding of the system. Archaeological and historical surveys conducted since the 1990s along the route of the Dead Road have documented abandoned locomotives, rusted rail sections, and camp remnants left essentially untouched since construction was halted in 1953, an entire industrial project simply frozen in place the moment political priorities shifted. Some contemporary Russian historians and journalists have worked to document and publicize this history despite periods of official reluctance to dwell on Stalin-era atrocities, an ongoing tension between historical reckoning and national narrative that continues to shape how this chapter of railway history is told, or not told, within Russia itself. Forced labor railway construction under Mao's government in China, particularly during the Great Leap Forward period, similarly prioritized rapid infrastructure output over worker welfare, contributing to a broader pattern of industrial projects during that campaign that historians have documented as carrying an enormous, still incompletely tallied human cost. International human rights organizations continue to monitor and document forced labor conditions connected to infrastructure projects in North Korea specifically, using satellite imagery and defector testimony in the absence of any independent on-the-ground access, a research method that has, over recent decades, produced an increasingly detailed, if still incomplete picture. Some former Gulag prisoners who survived railway construction projects went on, after eventual release, to become quiet, determined chroniclers of the system that had nearly killed them, their memoirs and testimonies now forming a crucial part of the historical record precisely because so much official Soviet documentation was deliberately destroyed or never created in the first place. Modern satellite imagery analysis of former Gulag railway routes has allowed researchers to identify camp locations and construction patterns invisible from the ground, a genuinely new tool bringing fresh, if incomplete, documentation to a history that Soviet authorities spent decades actively trying to erase from any official record. The sheer geographic scale of Soviet forced labor railway construction is difficult to convey without a map, spanning from European Russia through Siberia and into the Soviet Far East, a network of camps and half-finished lines large enough that some sections remain, even today, more thoroughly documented by satellite than by anyone who has actually walked them on the ground. Declassified Soviet archival material released gradually since the 1990s has allowed Western and Russian historians alike to build a considerably more precise picture of Gulag railway mortality than was possible during the Cold War, when most Western estimates relied entirely on the limited testimony of defectors and escaped prisoners. Memorial initiatives connected to Gulag railway history remain, even now, subject to shifting political winds within Russia itself, with some regional memorials facing funding cuts or bureaucratic obstruction in recent years, a reminder that even historical acknowledgement of past atrocity can remain a genuinely contested, unfinished project decades after the fact. A Shinkansen bullet train slices through the rice paddies of the Japanese countryside at close to 200 miles an hour, and inside the carriage, most passengers are not looking out the window at all. They're looking at the glowing screens of their phones, the actual landscape reduced to a blur too fast to properly register as scenery anymore. Japan opened the first Shinkansen line, the Takedo line between Tokyo and Osaka, in October 1964, timed deliberately to coincide with the Tokyo Olympics, a calculated statement to the world that Japan, less than 20 years after catastrophic wartime defeat, had rebuilt itself into a nation capable of genuinely cutting-edge engineering. The Shinkansen's safety record over the subsequent 6 decades is, by any honest measure, extraordinary. Not a single passenger fatality from a train collision or derailment on the core high-speed network in over 60 years of continuous operation, a statistic that stands in genuinely stark contrast to much of the darker history covered earlier in this series. France followed with its own high-speed program, the TGV, Train à Grande Vitesse, launching commercial service in 1981 on a purpose-built line between Paris and Lyon, soon reaching speeds that made even the pioneering Shinkansen look comparatively modest, and setting off a genuine international competition for high-speed rail supremacy that continues today. Building these dedicated high-speed corridors required something the earlier railway age rarely bothered with: careful, deliberate route planning to avoid existing communities entirely, because a train moving at nearly 200 miles an hour cannot navigate the tight curves and level crossings of an ordinary 19th century line. This meant slicing new corridors directly through farmland, forests, and in some cases straight through the middle of towns that had never asked to be split in two by a barrier that residents can hear from far away, but at these speeds can barely see before it has already passed. Noise pollution studies conducted around high-speed rail corridors in France, Japan, and later China and elsewhere have documented measurable, sustained health impacts on nearby residents, including sleep disruption and elevated stress markers for communities living within a few hundred meters of lines running dozens of trains a day at speeds that generate genuinely significant acoustic shock. There's also a more psychological, harder to quantify cost that several geographers and sociologists have written about specifically in relation to high-speed rail, sometimes using the term time-space compression, the disorienting sensation of a landscape being effectively erased by the sheer speed of passing through it. A journey that once took the better part of a day, with a traveler necessarily passing through and consciously registering dozens of towns, farms, and changing landscapes along the way, becomes instead a seamless, almost placeless tube connecting two city centers directly, with everything in between reduced to an irrelevant blur. China, beginning in the mid-2000s, built out the largest high-speed rail network on Earth with a speed of construction that dwarfed anything Japan or France had attempted. Tens of thousands of kilometers of new dedicated line laid within roughly 2 decades, transforming domestic travel across the country almost entirely. That expansion came with its own well-documented controversies, including a serious 2011 collision near Wenzhou that killed 40 people and raised uncomfortable, widely discussed questions about whether the pace of construction had, in certain cases, outrun the caution that such genuinely new technology demanded. High-speed rail's environmental case, compared to short-haul flights and car travel, is genuinely strong, and many transportation researchers consider one of the more promising tools available for reducing transportation-related carbon emissions, particularly across the kind of medium-distance routes, roughly 2 to 5 hours, where trains can realistically compete with air travel on total door-to-door time. But the human experience of that efficiency remains genuinely mixed. Frequent riders in Japan and France describe a real, if hard to articulate, sense of loss, the countryside itself becoming something you pass through rather than something you actually experience, a landscape flattened into pure travel time. This chapter of the story, unlike almost everything before it in this series, does not center on catastrophe or deliberate cruelty. It centers on a quieter kind of unease, the sense that in solving the ancient problem of distance so completely and so elegantly, something genuinely valuable about the journey itself, the sense of a landscape actually passing beneath you, has been quietly and permanently sacrificed. And yet even this relatively safe, relatively modern era of the railway had not escaped catastrophe entirely, because a much older, much more ordinary kind of railway, moving a very different kind of cargo, was quietly becoming dangerous again in a different part of the world through a much more familiar villain than speed, corporate negligence, and the deregulation that let it thrive. Engineers designing the original Shinkansen made a deliberate choice to use a wider track gauge than Japan's existing conventional rail network, building an entirely separate, dedicated high-speed system rather than attempting to upgrade shared track, a costly decision that nonetheless proved essential to the line's extraordinary safety record. The TGV's development in France was directly supported by substantial state investment, reflecting a broader post-war European tradition of treating rail infrastructure as a public good deserving serious government backing, a philosophy that contrasts sharply with the more market-driven and more troubled passenger rail history of the United States over the same decades. Communities along new high-speed corridors have organized, with varying degrees of success, to demand noise barriers, tunnel sections through sensitive areas, and compensation for property value impacts, an ongoing negotiation between national infrastructure ambition and local quality of life that shows no sign of fully resolving in any country building these lines. Taiwan, South Korea, and later mainland China each adapted elements of the original Shinkansen design philosophy when building their own high-speed networks, creating a kind of technological family tree across East Asia that traces directly back to that original 1964 Tokyo to Osaka line. Spain's high-speed avenue network, expanded rapidly from the late 1980s onward, now covers more high-speed route mileage than any single national network in Europe, a genuinely striking achievement for a country that, just a few decades earlier, had one of the continent's more modest conventional rail systems. High-speed rail advocates in the United States have pointed repeatedly to Japan and France as evidence that dedicated, well-funded intercity high-speed lines are technically and economically viable in principle, even as American attempts to build comparable infrastructure have, so far, struggled against a very different political and funding landscape than the one that enabled the Shinkansen or the TGV. Engineers behind high-speed rail systems continue refining aerodynamic design to reduce both energy consumption and the disruptive pressure wave a train generates when entering a tunnel at speed, an ongoing technical challenge that connects directly back to the same basic physics problems 19th century engineers first began to grapple with. Passenger surveys conducted on high-speed lines across Japan, France, and China consistently find that even riders who express genuine nostalgia for slower, more scenic rail travel overwhelmingly choose the faster option when it is available, a small but telling data point about the gap between what people say they value and what they actually do when time is genuinely on the line. China's high-speed rail expansion has been explicitly framed by the government as both an economic development tool and an instrument of national unity, connecting previously isolated interior regions to major coastal economic centers in ways that closely echo, whether intentionally or not, the 19th century rhetoric once used to promote Britain's and America's own railway expansions. Urban planners in cities newly connected by high-speed rail have documented measurable shifts in regional housing markets and commuting patterns within just a few years of a new station opening, evidence that these lines reshape not just travel time, but the underlying economic geography of entire regions. It is 1:15 in the morning on the 6th of July, 2013, in the small Quebec town of Lac-Mégantic, and 74 tank cars loaded with 7.7 million liters of crude oil are rolling, entirely without a crew on board, down a gentle grade directly toward the sleeping center of town. The train had been parked for the night on a slight incline outside town. Its air brakes engaged, and, according to the engineer's own account, a number of handbrakes also set, a common practice for an unattended train on the Montreal, Maine and Atlantic Railway, a short line company running with a skeleton crew as a matter of routine cost-saving policy. A fire broke out in the parked locomotive's engine earlier that night, and local firefighters, following standard procedure, shut the engine down to extinguish the blaze, a decision that investigators later determined also cut the air pressure, keeping the train's automatic air brakes engaged, leaving only the handbrakes to hold 74 loaded tank cars in place on a grade. It was not enough. Sometime after 11 p.m., the train began to creep forward, silently at first, gathering speed with absolutely nobody aboard to notice, down nearly 7 miles of track toward the center of Lac-Mégantic, reaching a speed investigators later calculated at around 65 miles an hour by the time it reached the town. The train derailed directly in the heart of downtown. At a curve the track was never designed to handle at anything close to that speed, and within seconds, the tank cars ruptured in a chain reaction of explosions that sent a fireball estimated by witnesses to have risen well over 1,000 feet into the night sky. 47 people died that night, most of them in or near the Music Cafe, a popular local bar sitting almost directly on the derailment site, killed within minutes by an inferno so intense that in several cases, identification of remains took investigators many months using dental and DNA records. Roughly half of the town's downtown core, a historic center with buildings dating back generations, was either destroyed outright in the fire or so contaminated by spilled crude oil that it later required demolition, permanently erasing a significant portion of Lac-Mégantic's original town center from the map. The investigation that followed, conducted jointly by Canadian and American regulators, uncovered a genuinely damning pattern of cost-cutting decisions layered one on top of another over years, each individually defensible perhaps, but together creating exactly the conditions for catastrophe. Single-person train crews, deferred track and equipment maintenance, weak internal safety culture that investigators described in unusually blunt regulatory language. This disaster arrived in the middle of a genuine boom in transporting crude oil by rail across North America, driven by the rapid expansion of shale oil production in places like North Dakota's Bakken Formation, oil that pipeline capacity simply could not keep pace with. So railways, largely unregulated for this specific new purpose, filled the gap at a breakneck pace. The specific type of tank car involved, known in the industry by the model number DOT-111, had been flagged by safety regulators as vulnerable to puncture in a derailment for years before the disaster, warnings that had not yet translated into mandatory replacement or retrofit requirements by the time Lac-Mégantic burned. Montreal, Maine and Atlantic Railway, the company operating the train, filed for bankruptcy within weeks of the disaster, and its chairman was among several individuals eventually charged criminally in connection with the disaster, though the criminal trial that followed years later resulted in acquittals for the employees charged, a verdict that many Lac-Mégantic residents found bitterly, deeply unsatisfying. In the disaster's aftermath, Canadian and American regulators did tighten rules around unattended trains, tank car standards, and crew size requirements for trains carrying hazardous materials. Changes that came, as this pattern in the series is shown again and again, only after the bodies had already been counted. Lac-Mégantic itself rebuilt, slowly and with visible, permanent scarring on its urban landscape, a new memorial park now marking the site of the Music Cafe, and the rail line through downtown was eventually rerouted around the town center entirely. A physical acknowledgement, years too late, that the tracks should never have run directly through the heart of a residential community carrying that kind of cargo in the first place. The people of Lac-Mégantic did not sign up to live beside a pipeline disguised as a railway. Very few communities anywhere in the world consciously choose that risk. They simply woke up one day to discover the tracks running past their homes had quietly, incrementally, been repurposed to carry something that could, under the wrong circumstances, kill them in their sleep. This disaster exposed something that had been true of the railway for its entire history, but had rarely been stated this plainly. Every efficiency, every cost-saving measure, every corner cut in the name of competitiveness ultimately gets tested against physics, and physics does not negotiate. But there was another kind of railway danger unfolding quietly all this time, one with no fireball, no headline, and almost no public conversation at all, playing out one platform edge at a time. Residents of Lac-Mégantic who survived that night have described, in interviews conducted in the years since, an ongoing struggle with what psychologists call complicated grief, made harder by the fact that the physical landscape of their town, the very streets and buildings tied to their memories, was permanently altered by the disaster itself. Regulatory reforms following the disaster included new requirements for at least 2 crew members on trains carrying dangerous goods in most jurisdictions, a rule that critics point out simply restored a safety standard that had existed before cost-cutting pressures eliminated it in the years leading up to 2013. Oil-by-rail traffic across North America has fluctuated significantly in the years since the disaster, shaped by pipeline capacity, crude oil prices, and the tightened safety regulations themselves, though the underlying question of whether rail is an appropriate long-term method for transporting large volumes of crude oil through populated areas remains genuinely contested. Independent investigations following the disaster also raised serious questions about whether Canadian rail safety regulators have been adequately staffed and funded to properly oversee short-line railways like Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic, a broader pattern of regulatory underfunding that critics argued extended well beyond this single company. A permanent memorial garden and museum dedicated to the 47 victims now stands in Lac-Mégantic, maintained in part through ongoing community fundraising, a quiet, deliberate act of civic memory in a town that, understandably, never wanted to become known primarily for the worst night in its history. Communities living near other North American rail corridors carrying similarly hazardous cargo have cited Lac-Mégantic directly and repeatedly in their own advocacy for stronger safety regulation, transforming one town's specific tragedy into a genuinely national and even continental point of reference for railway safety policy debates that continue today. Insurance industry analysts studying the Lac-Mégantic disaster afterward used it as a case study in how deferred maintenance and thin safety margins can compound quietly for years before finally producing a catastrophic, sudden failure, a pattern with clear echoes stretching all the way back to the Tay Bridge collapse that opened this documentary. Journalists who covered the Lac-Mégantic disaster in its immediate aftermath have since described it as a genuinely formative moment in North American environmental and safety journalism, a story that required reporters to become fluent, almost overnight, in the previously obscure technical details of tank car design and rail industry deregulation in order to properly explain to the public exactly what had gone wrong. The broader oil-by-rail safety debate that Lac-Mégantic intensified continues to intersect directly with ongoing pipeline politics across North America, since restricting rail transport of crude oil without expanding pipeline capacity simply shifts the underlying transportation risk from one mode to another rather than genuinely eliminating it. The specific chain of small, individually defensible decisions that produced the Lac-Mégantic disaster has since become a standard teaching example in industrial safety and risk management courses well beyond the railway sector itself, used to illustrate how catastrophic failure so often emerges from accumulated ordinary choices rather than any single dramatic act of negligence. A train driver closes her eyes at the end of a long shift and sees, as she has seen most nights for the past several years, the face of a stranger standing at the platform edge a fraction of a second before he stepped forward, a face she never asked to memorize and cannot now forget. This is not a rare or isolated experience within the railway industry. Studies conducted by transport authorities in Britain, Japan, Germany, and elsewhere consistently find that railway suicide represents a significant, if rarely publicly discussed, category of death on rail networks worldwide, with London's Network Rail alone recording several hundred such incidents annually across its system in recent years. The reasons the railway becomes, for some individuals, an acute crisis, a place associated with this kind of ending, are studied carefully by public health researchers, who generally point to accessibility, the sheer physical availability of platforms and level crossings within easy reach of daily life, as a significant factor alongside the grim, mistaken perception among some in crisis that the method offers a form of certainty. Media reporting guidelines in most countries now deliberately avoid detailed description of specific locations or methods connected to railway deaths, a practice developed directly in response to substantial public health research showing that detailed coverage can measurably increase the likelihood of further incidents at the same or similar sites, a phenomenon researchers refer to as contagion. Train drivers who experience one of these incidents are, in most well-run railway systems today, given mandatory time off and access to counseling, a recognition, hard-won over recent decades, that being the operator of a vehicle involved in a fatality, entirely without fault or any ability to prevent it given the physics of stopping distance, causes genuine, lasting psychological trauma. Research conducted among railway staff who have experienced these incidents documents rates of post-traumatic stress symptoms that many occupational health specialists consider comparable to those found in other high-exposure professions, including some emergency response in military roles, a genuinely striking finding given how rarely railway work is publicly discussed in that same category. Station staff, cleaners, and the emergency responders who arrive at the scene all carry their own version of this weight, often with far less institutional support than drivers receive, doing the practical, physically and emotionally difficult work of managing a scene that the traveling public passing through an hour later will likely never know occurred at all. Some railway networks have invested significantly in physical prevention measures over recent decades, platform edge doors that create a physical barrier between passengers and the track, most extensively deployed across Japan's rail network, and increasingly on newer metro lines in cities including London, Paris, and Singapore. Measures that studies have shown can meaningfully reduce incidents at the stations where they are installed. Other interventions are less visible, but similarly evidence-based. Blue lighting installed at some station platforms in Japan and Britain, following research suggesting it may have a calming psychological effect during moments of acute crisis, alongside signage directing individuals in distress toward crisis helplines rather than simply warning them away from the platform edge. Samaritans, the British crisis support charity, has worked directly and extensively with the rail industry since the 1990s on prevention training for frontline staff, teaching station employees to recognize warning signs and intervene safely and compassionately, a partnership credited with measurably reducing incidents at stations where staff have received this specific training. There is a particular quiet cruelty in how invisible this entire category of railway history remains compared to the dramatic disasters covered elsewhere in this series. No memorial plaques, no anniversary news coverage, no public monuments, just an ongoing, largely unspoken pattern that railway staff carry, shift after shift, mostly in silence, mostly alone. If this chapter has been difficult to sit with, that difficulty is entirely appropriate. And if any part of it has felt close to your own life or to someone you love, please do not carry that weight without support. Reaching out to a crisis line or a trusted person is a genuine act of strength, not a failure, and help really is available. The railway, across 2 centuries now, has been asked to carry almost every category of human experience imaginable: commerce and war, empire and genocide, luxury and desperation. And in this specific, quieter way, it has also carried our species' oldest and most private pain, largely without public acknowledgement. That is changing slowly as prevention research and staff support programs continue to expand across networks worldwide. And as this particular human vulnerability was finally beginning to receive more careful institutional attention, an entirely different kind of vulnerability was quietly opening up elsewhere on the network. Not in the hearts of passengers or drivers, but in the lines of code now running the signals, the switches, and increasingly the trains themselves. Research into railway suicide prevention has increasingly emphasized a public health approach that treats the issue with the same seriousness as any other major cause of preventable death, moving away from older, more stigmatizing frameworks and toward evidence-based intervention, staff training, and physical infrastructure investment. Several rail operators now publish, or at minimum privately track, incident data specifically to identify locations with disproportionately high rates, allowing targeted investment in fencing, lighting, and platform barriers at the specific sites where research shows intervention is likely to have the greatest measurable impact. Peer support programs, where railway staff who have experienced a fatality themselves mentor colleagues going through the same experience, have become increasingly standard practice across major networks, reflecting a hard-won institutional understanding that professional counseling alone does not always reach staff who are more comfortable talking to someone who has genuinely lived through the same moment. Some transport authorities have begun publishing anonymized annual reports specifically detailing prevention program outcomes, a transparency shift intended partly to normalize public conversation about an issue that has, for generations, been treated as almost unspeakable within the industry itself, despite its very real and ongoing human toll. Families of those lost to railway suicide have, in a number of documented cases, become powerful advocates for prevention, funding, and awareness, transforming personal grief into sustained public campaigning that has directly influenced policy changes at several major rail networks around the world. Design guidelines for new railway stations in several countries now explicitly incorporate suicide prevention research from the earliest planning stages, including sight lines, lighting, and platform layout considerations that a generation ago would never have been part of standard architectural practice for this kind of infrastructure. Some railway operators now train station staff using scenario-based simulation specifically designed around escalation and compassionate intervention, treating this kind of training with the same seriousness given to fire safety or emergency evacuation procedures, a shift in institutional priority that took the industry decades to fully embrace. It is worth stating clearly, as this chapter closes, that the presence of prevention infrastructure and trained staff at a station does demonstrably save lives. A body of research findings that transport authorities increasingly treat not as a soft or secondary consideration, but as a core, measurable part of what safe railway operation actually means in the 21st century. Academic researchers studying railway suicide prevention increasingly collaborate directly across national borders, sharing data and intervention strategies between countries with very different rail cultures, recognizing that a measure proven effective on the London Underground may need meaningful adaptation before it works equally well on a rural line in France or Japan. It is worth ending this particular chapter on a note of demonstrated hope rather than only grief. Stations that have implemented comprehensive prevention programs, combining physical barriers, staff training, and visible crisis support signage together, have documented measurable, sustained reductions in incidents, solid evidence that this is a problem genuinely responsive to sustained, thoughtful intervention rather than something communities must simply learn to live with. Inside a centralized rail control center, somewhere in a windowless room lit mostly by monitors, a single operator watches a wall of screens as a scheduling algorithm silently reroutes several hundred trains across a metropolitan network in response to a delay several miles away, a decision made and executed in milliseconds, with the human in the room functioning largely as a supervisor rather than a controller. This is the modern reality of railway signaling across much of the developed world, a system that has moved over the past several decades from mechanical levers physically connected by wire to distant switches to towards centralized, software-driven traffic management systems capable of coordinating vastly more trains, more precisely, than any team of human signalmen ever could. The efficiency gains are genuinely enormous. Automated systems can safely run trains closer together and more precisely optimized speeds than human operators reacting to mechanical signals ever managed, which is a significant part of why cities like London, Paris, and Singapore have been able to expand metro capacity substantially without laying a single additional mile of track. Fully driverless trains are now in everyday operation on numerous metro systems worldwide, including lines in Paris, London's Docklands Light Railway, Singapore, and Dubai, systems that have accumulated, in most cases, strong safety records over years of operation, largely because a closed, purpose-built metro environment is considerably easier to fully automate than an open mainline network sharing space with other traffic. But that same digitization, the very thing that makes the modern network so efficient, also introduces a category of vulnerability that simply did not exist in the era of mechanical semaphore signals and hand-thrown switches, because a system controlled by software is, in principle, a system that can potentially be attacked through software. In December 2016, San Francisco's Municipal Railway, known locally as Muni, suffered a ransomware attack that disabled the agency's fare collection and station computer systems, forcing staff to let passengers ride free for an entire weekend while technicians worked to isolate and recover the affected systems, a genuinely striking, if relatively contained, real-world demonstration of railway systems' exposure to digital attack. Security researchers and rail industry cybersecurity specialists have, in subsequent years, documented and publicly demonstrated a range of theoretical vulnerabilities in railway signaling protocols, some of them built on legacy communication standards developed decades ago, well before cybersecurity was a serious design consideration for critical infrastructure of any kind. A 2015 case in Poland, widely reported at the time, involved a teenager who reportedly built a modified television remote control capable of triggering track switch signals, causing several tram derailments in the city of Lodz and injuries to a number of passengers, a low-tech, almost improvised demonstration of exactly the kind of vulnerability that keeps rail cybersecurity specialists awake at night, scaled up to a modern digital signaling system. Rail industry security specialists and government infrastructure agencies in multiple countries have, in recent years, conducted penetration testing and issued formal warnings about the cybersecurity posture of legacy signaling systems still in operation across significant portions of aging rail networks. Systems designed in an era when the primary security concern was simply keeping the wrong physical person out of a locked signal box. The genuinely unsettling question that follows from all of this is not really about any single attack scenario, however dramatic. It is about trust and about what happens to a system this complex, this interconnected, and this increasingly automated the moment something inside it behaves in a way that nobody, human or algorithmic, correctly anticipated in advance. Railway engineers working on autonomous train technology speak carefully and consistently about the concept of fail-safe design, systems engineered so that any detected fault or anomaly defaults automatically to the safest possible state, typically bringing trains to a controlled stop rather than continuing to operate under uncertain conditions. A principle inherited directly from the earliest days of mechanical interlocking signal boxes in the 19th century. That inherited caution is genuinely reassuring, and it is a major reason why fully automated metro systems maintain such strong safety records in practice. But it also depends entirely on every layer of a now deeply interconnected digital system correctly recognizing a genuine fault as a fault, rather than being deceived, confused, or simply overwhelmed by something its designers never adequately modeled or imagined. As railways worldwide continue integrating artificial intelligence into scheduling, predictive maintenance, and increasingly direct train operation itself. The fundamental question this chapter keeps circling remains genuinely open and, frankly, is not going to be settled by this documentary or by any single piece of legislation. What happens when no human hand remains on the throttle, and the machine dreaming up the schedule dreams something none of us saw coming? This question, cold and impersonal in a way that almost nothing else in this series has been, sits at the exact edge of the railway's living history. The point where the story stops being about what has already happened and starts becoming about what has not been decided yet. But before we look forward into that uncertainty, there is one more direction this story has to travel, and it runs backward into silence rather than forward into code. Because scattered across every continent this railway ever touched, there are lines that the algorithm, the investor, and the empire alike have all simply walked away from, left to the wind and to time. Rail cybersecurity specialists frequently point out that many legacy signaling systems still in operation were never designed with any internet connectivity in mind at all, meaning some of their vulnerability comes not from the original design, but from later, sometimes poorly secured, efforts to bolt modern remote monitoring capability onto genuinely old infrastructure. Government infrastructure protection agencies in multiple countries have, in recent years, formally classified railway, signaling, and control systems as critical national infrastructure, a designation that brings additional regulatory scrutiny and funding for security upgrades. Though implementation across genuinely vast, aging networks remains, inevitably, a slow and expensive process. Advocates for continued automation point out, with considerable justification, that human error remains statistically responsible for a significant share of railway incidents worldwide, meaning the honest safety calculation is rarely a simple choice between a trustworthy human and an untrustworthy machine, but rather a genuinely difficult comparison between two different, imperfect categories of risk. Some rail operators have begun running dedicated cybersecurity red team exercises, hiring ethical hackers to actively attempt to breach signaling and control systems under controlled conditions, a proactive defensive posture borrowed directly from the broader technology industry's approach to critical vulnerability discovery. International rail bodies have, in recent years, begun developing shared cybersecurity standards specifically for signaling protocols, recognizing that a vulnerability discovered on one national network is very likely to exist on others using similar or identical underlying legacy technology, a genuinely global problem requiring genuinely coordinated solutions. The broader technology industry's growing interest in railway automation has brought new investment and expertise into the sector. Though rail engineers frequently caution that the closed, highly regulated environment of a metro system differs enormously from the open, variable conditions of a mainline network shared with freight, pedestrians, and level crossings. The broader debate around railway automation increasingly includes labor unions directly, whose members have raised legitimate concerns about job security alongside the purely technical safety questions, ensuring that the human cost of this particular transition, unlike so many earlier chapters in this history, is at least being actively discussed in advance rather than only afterward. Academic conferences dedicated specifically to rail cybersecurity have grown substantially in size and frequency over the past decade, drawing together engineers, ethical hackers, and policymakers in a field that essentially did not exist as a formal discipline before the widespread digitization of signaling systems began in earnest in the 1990s and 2000s. The 2016 San Francisco Muni incident, though relatively minor in its ultimate operational impact, prompted a broader wave of infrastructure security audits across major transit agencies in North America, a direct, practical example of how a single contained incident can meaningfully shift industry-wide security priorities almost overnight. Insurance underwriters covering rail infrastructure have, in recent years, begun explicitly pricing cybersecurity risk into their assessments alongside more traditional categories like derailment or collision, a quiet but telling sign of how seriously the financial industry now treats digital vulnerability within the sector. In a quiet forest in rural Pennsylvania, a rusting steam locomotive sits half swallowed by moss and creeping vine, its cracked firebox now serving as a den for a family of red foxes who have raised at least 2 litters of kits inside the cold iron chamber where, 60 years ago, coal once burned at close to 2,000 degrees. This particular engine, and thousands like it scattered across former industrial regions worldwide, was simply left where it last stopped when its line closed, too expensive to scrap and haul away, not valuable enough to preserve, existing now in a strange limbo between machine and landscape feature. Britain alone carries thousands of miles of these ghost lines, closed variously by the beaching cuts of the 1960s or by earlier economic failures dating back to the railway mania collapse of the 1840s. Their routes still faintly traceable in aerial photography as long, curving lines of slightly different vegetation cutting across otherwise ordinary farmland. Walk certain of these old routes today, particularly the ones converted into public footpaths, and you pass through cuttings where damp brick tunnel mouths, sealed decades ago with concrete blocks for safety, still bear faded painted mileage markers. Numbers meant for a train driver who has been retired, in most cases for longer than many walkers on the path have been alive. In the American West, entire transcontinental spurs built with enormous 19th century ambition now sit entirely abandoned across stretches of Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming desert, their wooden ties baked and split by decades of unbroken sun, rails sometimes still bolted in place because there was at some point simply no longer any economic reason to bother pulling up the steel. Some of these desert lines, remarkably, still bear the original iron stamped with a manufacturer's mark and a date from the 1870s or 1880s, sitting exposed to the elements for a century and a half. A genuinely strange, kind of open-air museum that almost nobody visits because almost nobody knows it is there. Russia's Far East holds some of the most haunting examples anywhere on Earth. Abandoned stations along the unfinished portions of the Gulag-era dead road, sitting in genuinely remote taiga wilderness. Their wooden platforms slowly rotting, small offices still containing rusted stoves, and, in a handful of documented cases, decades-old paperwork left exactly where a clerk set it down for the final time. There's something close to the sublime in the old, unsettling sense of that word, standing at a site like this. Not conventionally beautiful, but genuinely awe-inducing in a way that involves a small, honest measure of dread, the visible, physical proof of just how quickly and how completely a structure built to represent permanent human ambition can be swallowed back into the landscape it once cut through. Urban explorers and railway historians have documented abandoned stations in the very heart of major cities too, not just remote wilderness. New York's City Hall subway station, closed since 1945, its ornate tiled ceiling and elegant chandeliers preserved in near total darkness beneath streets that millions of people walk over every single day without any idea what sits below them. Paris holds several so-called ghost stations along its metro system too, stations built or partially built but never opened, or opened briefly and then closed, their platforms visible for a few flickering seconds to passengers on passing trains who catch a glimpse of tiled walls and old advertising posters frozen in whatever decade the station was abandoned. What makes these sites so quietly powerful across every continent this documentary has covered is the specific combination of human ambition and natural indifference sitting side by side, without any need for commentary or embellishment. The railway builders of every era we have discussed genuinely believed, on some level, that what they were constructing would last. Almost none of it, in the end, actually does. Ecologists studying these abandoned corridors have found, somewhat unexpectedly, that many former rail lines have become genuinely valuable wildlife habitat and migration corridors. The very narrowness and linearity that once made them efficient for trains now making them efficient, in an entirely different sense for foxes, deer, and countless bird species moving through otherwise fragmented, developed landscapes. There is a strange, quiet comfort in that particular fact. even amid everything darker this series has covered. The railway, responsible across 2 centuries for so much documented human suffering and so much genuine progress in roughly equal measure, is at least in its abandonment, giving something back to the landscapes it once so thoroughly disrupted. But abandonment on this scale, multiplied across every continent, every era, every empire this documentary has traced, also poses a much larger, much stranger question, one that pulls this entire story out of history and into something closer to deep time. What happens when every railway on Earth has eventually gone the way of that locomotive in the Pennsylvania woods? That is genuinely where this story has to end. Not with another disaster, and not with another triumph, but with a single, quiet, honest question about what all of this, the iron, the blood, the empire, the speed, actually adds up to once every train on Earth has finally, permanently stopped. In parts of the former Soviet Union, abandoned rail infrastructure sits alongside other categories of Cold War-era ruin, decommissioned military installations, and shuttered factory towns, together forming a genuinely vast landscape of 20th century industrial abandonment that historians and photographers have only begun to seriously document in recent decades. Preservation debates around abandoned railway sites often pit historical or ecological value directly against redevelopment pressure, particularly for lines running through increasingly valuable urban land, a tension that has led to the genuine loss of several historically significant sites, even as public interest in railway heritage has, broadly, grown. Photographers specializing in what has become known as ruin photography have built substantial online followings documenting abandoned rail infrastructure, specifically a genre of visual art that raises its own ethical questions about aestheticizing decay and, in some cases, sites connected to genuine historical suffering. Some abandoned rail corridors have been deliberately left unrestored by local authorities specifically because of their value as informal wildlife sanctuaries, a quiet policy choice that treats decay itself as a legitimate, worthwhile outcome rather than a problem requiring correction, a genuinely new way of thinking about infrastructure's afterlife. Local historical societies in former mining and railway towns across the world continue cataloging and mapping these lost lines, often relying entirely on volunteer labor and community fundraising, quietly ensuring that even routes with no remaining physical trace at all are not entirely erased from the historical record. Some abandoned rail bridges and viaducts have been structurally stabilized and reopened specifically as pedestrian and cycling crossings, a second functional life that preserves the physical silhouette of the original railway, even as its actual purpose changes entirely. Iron and stone finding new relevance long after the last train ever crossed them. A handful of former railway workers who spent entire careers on lines later closed or abandoned have, in recorded oral histories, described a very particular grief at visiting their former routes decades later. Walking tracks now silent and overgrown that they once kept meticulously running, on time, every single day. There is a particular kind of quiet, patient dignity in how these abandoned lines age. No dramatic collapse, no single defining moment of failure, just a slow, steady handover from human maintenance to natural process, rust and root, and weather working at exactly the pace nature always works at, entirely indifferent to how urgently the line was once needed. Some countries have begun formally cataloging their abandoned rail heritage as part of broader national historic preservation frameworks, granting selected disused lines and structures the same legal protected status typically reserved for castles, cathedrals, and other more conventionally celebrated categories of historic monument. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for any abandoned railway is not a plaque or a memorial at all, but simply the sound of wind moving through grass grown up between 2 rusted rails, a sound the original navvies and engineers who built the line, straining under an entirely different kind of urgency, never once had the leisure to actually stop and listen for. Imagine an archaeologist from some distant future, thousands of years from now, brushing dust and soil away from two parallel lines of rusted iron that stretch arrow straight to the horizon in both directions, with absolutely no way of immediately knowing what they were for. She would likely notice, fairly quickly, the astonishing consistency of the gauge, the exact distance between these two rails holding steady across an entire buried continent, a level of standardized precision that, to her, might read as evidence of an almost religious devotion to exactness, which, in its own way, it genuinely was. This documentary has covered roughly 200 years of railway history, and across every single one of the last 19 chapters, one pattern keeps repeating with a consistency that starts to feel less like coincidence and more like something closer to a law of human nature. Wherever this technology went, it carried both genuine liberation and genuine devastation in roughly equal, tangled, inseparable measure. The wagonways freed coal from beneath the earth and buried children beneath it in the process. The transcontinental lines connected a fractured nation and shattered an existing one that had been there first. The Reichsbahn's efficient timetables, the very same disciplined engineering the Victorians were once so proud of, became a delivery mechanism for the worst atrocity of the entire 20th century. Even the quieter, less violent chapters carry this same tension. High-speed rail connects distant cities in hours while genuinely erasing the experience of everything in between. Digital signaling makes the network safer and more efficient while opening entirely new categories of vulnerability nobody in the 19th century could have possibly imagined needing to defend against. Geologists and environmental historians increasingly use the term Anthropocene to describe the current geological epoch, one defined, unlike any before it, by the measurable, permanent impact of a single species on the planet's rock, soil, and atmosphere. The railway, in a very real and very literal sense, is one of the clearest physical signatures of that epoch, a scar visible from orbit, running across every inhabited continent on Earth. Every mile of track laid required cutting through rock that had sat undisturbed for millions of years, filling valleys, diverting rivers, and burning, across 2 centuries of steam and diesel operation combined, an amount of coal and oil that future geologists will almost certainly be able to trace directly in atmospheric carbon records laid down in ice cores and sediment. The rails themselves, made largely of steel that will not fully corrode away for many centuries under most conditions, and in some especially dry or cold environments, potentially for far longer than that, will likely remain as identifiable, if badly rusted, physical objects in the archaeological record for longer than most of the great stone monuments humanity has built across its entire recorded history. There is something worth sitting within that fact. The buildings, the cities, the empires that built these railways will, in every case, eventually crumble, be rebuilt, or simply vanish. The rails themselves, humble, mass-produced, unglamorous strips of rolled steel, may very well outlast every single one of them as a physical object. That is either a deeply unsettling thought or a strangely comforting one, and I genuinely think it depends entirely on the day you are having when you consider it. Humanity's monuments to conquest and cruelty and progress and connection, all of it tangled together inseparably, may end up being remembered, quite literally, by 2 straight lines of rusted metal and nothing else. We opened this documentary on a storm-swept December night in 1879, watching a bridge dissolve into black water beneath a train whose passengers never saw it coming. It feels right now to close somewhere close to that same image, but inverted, because this time we get to see it coming, and we still, mostly, choose to build anyway. That choice, to keep building despite the cost, to keep connecting despite the devastation that connection has so often required, is not a simple story of either progress or ruin. It is both, constantly at the same time, and this entire 200-year history has been an extended, often brutal argument about which of those 2 forces gets to win in any given decade, any given country, any given mile of track. Picture one final time, the very last train that will ever run on planet Earth. Whenever that day eventually comes, whether in 50 years or 500, its carriage is entirely empty, rolling gently to a stop on a track nobody has scheduled any further service for, its headlamp finally going dark, and somewhere down the line behind it, one by one, in a sequence that took 2 centuries to build and only a few quiet seconds to complete, every signal light on the entire network blinking out. The story of the railway does not really end there, not cleanly, and it was never going to. It just fades the way most true things eventually do into a long, open, honestly unanswerable question about what exactly it is that we build and why, and who in the end actually pays for it. Every technology this documentary has examined, the wagonway, the locomotive, the timetable, the signal box, the algorithm, shares one quality across every single era and every single continent. It was built by people who believed sincerely that they were solving a problem and who very rarely paused to ask who exactly would be left paying for the solution. That is not a uniquely railway failing. It is, if anything, a fairly complete portrait of how humanity builds almost everything, and the railway simply happens to be one of the clearest, most physically visible examples we have, laid out in iron across every continent, available for anyone willing to actually look at the whole of it honestly. If there is a single thread running underneath every chapter of this 200-year story, it might simply be this. Every generation that built a new railway line believed, with total sincerity, that this time the benefits would clearly outweigh the costs, and every single generation afterward discovered, in its own way, just how much more complicated that arithmetic actually was. Perhaps the fairest way to close a story this large and this contradictory is simply to hold both truths at once, without forcing either to cancel the other out. The railway connected this world more completely than almost any invention before it, and it did so by demanding a price, paid overwhelmingly by people who never got a meaningful vote in the decision, a debt this documentary has tried, honestly, to at least name. If this documentary has one final honest request of anyone watching, it is simply this. The next time you board a train, or drive across a bridge, or pass beneath an old railway embankment grown thick with grass, take one moment to remember that behind the smooth, ordinary convenience of the journey sits 2 centuries of exactly the history you have just spent the last several hours learning. 200 years ago, a child crawled through a dripping tunnel dragging coal on a wooden wagon, certain of nothing except the next few feet of track ahead of him. Tonight, somewhere on this same planet, a train slides silently through the dark at nearly 200 miles an hour, its passengers barely aware they are moving at all. Both of them, in their own way, built the same world we are all still living in. Every rail we have discussed across this documentary, whether laid by a Victorian navvy, a Chinese immigrant laborer, a Soviet prisoner, or a modern robotic tamping machine, ultimately serves exactly the same simple, stubborn purpose it always has to carry a human being somewhere they were not a moment before, and to bring them home again, or not, depending entirely on the century, the country, and the cost someone else was willing to pay for that journey. None of the 20 chapters in this documentary were chosen to provide a tidy moral. They were chosen because, together, they are simply true, and because a technology this consequential deserves to be remembered in its entirety, the wonder alongside the wreckage, rather than in the comfortable, half-finished version so many of us grew up with.